February 5th, 2025. Bear destroys $900,000 RV. Retirees killed in Yosemite. February 5th, 2025. Bear destroys 900K RV. Retirees killed in Yosemite. The morning mist clung to the towering granite cliffs of Yosemite Valley like ghostly fingers, slowly retreating as the first rays of February sunlight pierced through the cathedral of ancient sequoias. Harold William Peters, 73 years old, stepped out of his pristine Newell Coach Model 1938 motorhome and breathed in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine needles and distant snow. The luxury RV, worth nearly $900,000, gleamed like a chrome-plated monument to retirement dreams fulfilled, its 45-foot length dwarfing the surrounding campsite at Wawona Campground. "June, you have to see this sunrise," Harold called softly to his wife of 47 years, his voice carrying the satisfied contentment of a man who had worked 3 decades as a structural engineer for Boeing before cashing in his pension and 401k for the adventure of a lifetime. His weathered hands, still strong despite his age, adjusted the awning mechanism with practiced efficiency. The couple had been living full-time in their rolling palace for 8 months now, traveling from their former home in Bellevue, Washington, down through Oregon, California, and now into the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains. June Marie Peters, 71, emerged from the RV's mahogany-paneled interior, wearing a thick purple fleece jacket and carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee in bone china cups that somehow survived every mile of their journey. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour, a testament to the habits of a retired elementary school principal who had spent 35 years maintaining order and appearance for the children of Kirkland, Washington. She had been reluctant about this whole RV adventure at first, worried about leaving behind their comfortable suburban life, their garden, their bridge club, their predictable routines. But Harold had worn her down with promises of grandchildren visits, national parks, and the freedom to wake up somewhere new whenever they chose. "It's beautiful, Harry," she said, settling into one of the expensive camping chairs he had positioned to face east toward the valley's rim. "Though I still don't understand why we couldn't have stayed at that nice RV resort in Fresno. This primitive camping makes me nervous." Harold smiled and accepted his coffee, savoring both the warmth and his wife's familiar concerns. They had been having variations of this conversation for months. June was a creature of comfort and predictability, while he craved the wild spaces he had dreamed about during decades of confined office work. "The brochures said Wawona was one of the most beautiful campgrounds in the entire park system," he said. "Besides, we have everything we need right here. Full hookups, generator backup, satellite internet. It's hardly primitive." The Newell Coach was indeed a marvel of modern engineering and luxury. Its custom interior featured Italian leather seating, granite countertops, a residential-sized refrigerator, a king-size sleep number bed, and enough technology to rival a small spacecraft. The chassis was built on a Caterpillar C-15 engine, capable of hauling their 14,000 pounds of rolling home up the steepest mountain grades without strain. Harold had spent months researching, comparing specifications, visiting dealerships, and finally writing a check that represented a significant portion of their life savings. It was his dream machine, the vehicle that would carry them safely and comfortably through their golden years. Their campsite, number 47, was positioned on the outer loop of Wawona Campground, approximately 2 miles south of the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias and 15 miles from Yosemite Valley proper. The National Park Service had designated this area as suitable for large RVs, though the surrounding wilderness remained wild and largely untamed. dense forests of ponderosa pine, incense cedar, and Douglas fir pressed close to the camping areas, with only thin barriers of manzanita brush and scattered boulders marking the boundary between civilization and the vast wilderness that stretched uninterrupted for hundreds of square miles in every direction. Harold had deliberately chosen the site for its relative isolation. Their nearest neighbors were a young family from Colorado in a modest travel trailer positioned about 50 yards away, and an elderly couple from Arizona in a Class A motorhome, perhaps 75 yards in the opposite direction. The Colorado family consisted of Dr. Michael and Sarah Richardson, both emergency room physicians from Denver, along with their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, aged 12. They had driven their 28-foot Airstream Interstate here for a week of cross-country skiing and nature photography, their first vacation in over 2 years of pandemic-related hospital shifts. Dr. Michael Richardson, 41 years old, had been working emergency medicine for 15 years, specializing in trauma cases that frequently involved wilderness accidents, animal attacks, and extreme sports injuries. His wife, Sarah, 39, was a pediatric emergency specialist who had seen everything from playground accidents to child abuse cases. Both doctors had developed the kind of calm, analytical mindset that served them well in crisis situations, though neither had ever encountered anything like what was approaching their peaceful campground. The Arizona couple, Robert and Margaret Hendricks, both in their late 60s, were veteran RV travelers who had been crisscrossing the country for 5 years since Robert's retirement from a career in insurance sales. They had witnessed their share of campground drama over the years: domestic disputes, medical emergencies, severe weather events, even a few encounters with wildlife. But Robert, a methodical man who kept detailed logs of their travels, weather conditions, and notable events, would later describe the next 48 hours as unlike anything in their extensive experience. The morning of February 3rd had begun unremarkably. Harold completed his routine RV inspection, checking tire pressure, fluid levels, and electrical connections with the thoroughness of a man trained to spot structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. June organized their interior space with the precision she had once applied to her classroom, ensuring that every item had its designated place and that nothing could shift or break during travel days. They had been parked at Wawona for 3 days, planning to stay for a full week before continuing south to Joshua Tree National Park. The weather forecast called for clear, cold conditions, with nighttime temperatures dropping into the 20s and daytime highs barely reaching the 40s. Perfect February weather for Yosemite, according to the park rangers who had checked their permits and campground reservations. Harold had purchased an America the Beautiful senior pass that provided them access to all national parks, and he was determined to make the most of their investment. What neither Harold nor the park rangers knew was that the unusually warm autumn, followed by the sudden cold snap, had disrupted normal wildlife patterns throughout the Sierra Nevada ecosystem. Black bears, which should have been deep in hibernation by February, were experiencing irregular sleep cycles. Some were waking periodically, driven by hunger and disorientation, to search for food sources they would normally ignore during winter months. California Department of Fish and Wildlife biologist Dr. Amanda Chen had been tracking this phenomenon for several weeks, noting increased bear activity reports from park rangers, campers, and residential areas throughout the Sierra Nevada range. At 34 years old, Dr. Chen was considered one of the state's leading experts on black bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. She had completed her doctoral dissertation on the effects of climate change on ursine hibernation patterns, and the data she was collecting this winter supported her most troubling predictions. "We're seeing bears that should be dormant exhibiting aggressive foraging behavior," she had written in her preliminary report dated January 28th. exactly 1 week before the Peters family arrived at Wawona. Disrupted hibernation cycles appear to be creating conditions where bears are simultaneously lethargic from winter torpor and desperately hungry. This combination could make them unpredictably dangerous, as their normal fear responses to humans may be compromised by metabolic confusion. Dr. Chen had recommended increased ranger patrols in popular camping areas and enhanced food storage enforcement. But budget constraints and staffing limitations meant that many of her suggestions remained unimplemented. Yosemite National Park employed only 12 full-time rangers to patrol over 1,100 square miles of wilderness, with Wawona Campground typically checked only twice per day during the winter months. Park Ranger Jennifer Martinez, 29 years old, had been assigned to the Wawona district for 3 years, following her graduation from the National Park Service Law Enforcement Training Center. She was scheduled to conduct her evening patrol of the campground at approximately 6 p.m. on February 4th, a routine check that would involve driving through the camping loops, ensuring proper food storage, and addressing any visitor concerns or violations. Ranger Martinez had received Dr. Chen's wildlife activity reports and was aware of increased bear sightings throughout the park, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the scale of what was developing. Her training covered standard bear encounter protocols, food storage enforcement, and basic first aid, but the severity of what was approaching exceeded all established response procedures. The first sign of trouble came at 2:17 p.m. on February 4th, when Harold Peters noticed damage to the garbage container near their campsite. The heavy-duty metal container, designed to be bear-resistant, showed scratches and dents that suggested a large animal had been testing its defenses. Harold examined the damage with the careful attention he had once applied to stress fractures in aircraft components, noting the depth and pattern of the claw marks. "June, come look at this," he called, running his fingers along the gouged metal. "I think we might have had a visitor last night." June approached reluctantly, her natural caution heightened by their isolation from familiar surroundings. "What kind of visitor?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Bear, most likely. These claw marks are fresh, and the container's been pushed around." Harold straightened up, his engineer's mind automatically calculating the force required to move the several hundred-pound garbage receptacle. Must have been a good-sized one. The couple spent the next hour securing their campsite more carefully, moving anything with a scent into the RV's interior and double-checking the locks on their external storage compartments. Harold prided himself on following park regulations precisely, and they had been storing food properly since their arrival. But the evidence of nocturnal investigation made them both uneasy. Dr. Michael Richardson noticed their activity from his campsite and approached with the casual friendliness that often develops between RV neighbors. "Having some trouble?" he asked, noting their concerned expressions and Harold's examination of the damaged container. "Looks like we had a bear checking things out last night," Harold explained, pointing out the claw marks and displaced gravel around the garbage area. "First time we've seen evidence like this." Dr. Richardson examined the damage with professional interest. His emergency room experience included numerous animal attack cases, and he had developed a working knowledge of injury patterns caused by various wildlife species. The claw marks on the garbage container were deeper and more extensive than he would have expected from a typical black bear investigation. "Have you reported this to the rangers?" he asked. "They like to keep track of bear activity, especially in the campgrounds." Harold nodded toward the RV, where June was already dialing the park service number posted on their campsite information board. "She's calling it in now. Probably just routine, but better safe than sorry." The conversation that followed would later be analyzed by multiple agencies as a critical missed opportunity for prevention. The Park Service dispatcher, a seasonal employee with limited wildlife training, recorded the report as a routine bear sighting and assured June that such incidents were common and rarely escalated into dangerous encounters. No additional ranger patrols were scheduled, no warning notices were posted, and no systematic search for the bear was initiated. This casual response reflected the Park Service's standard approach to black bear incidents, which historically had resulted in very few serious injuries compared to the thousands of successful camping experiences each year. However, the protocols were designed for normal circumstances, involving healthy bears following predictable behavioral patterns, not for the climate-disrupted conditions that Dr. Chen's research was documenting. At 4:30 p.m., Sarah Richardson was preparing dinner in their Airstream when she glimpsed movement through the kitchen window that faced toward the Peters campsite. A large, dark shape was moving slowly between the trees, approximately 100 yards away, appearing and disappearing behind the thick pine trunks like a shadow-given substance. She called quietly to her husband, who was helping their daughters with homework at the dinette table. "Michael, can you come here for a minute?" "I think there's something in the woods." Dr. Richardson joined his wife at the window, peering through the late afternoon shadows toward the area she indicated. For several seconds, they saw nothing. Then the shape emerged more clearly. A black bear, significantly larger than either of them had expected, moving with the deliberate swaying gait characteristic of the species. "How big do you think it is?" Sarah whispered, though the animal was far enough away that normal conversation wouldn't have disturbed it. Michael studied the bear's proportions relative to the surrounding trees and boulders, mentally calculating the measurements that might be relevant if medical treatment became necessary. Hard to say for sure, but that's a good-sized animal, maybe 250, 300 pounds. Not huge for a black bear, but definitely not small. They watched the bear for approximately 10 minutes as it moved through the forest in a roughly circular pattern around the campground. Its behavior seemed purposeful rather than random, as if it were conducting a systematic reconnaissance of the area. Occasionally it would pause, lift its head to test the air currents, then continue its deliberate patrol. "Should we warn the other campers?" Sarah asked, thinking particularly of the elderly couple in the expensive motorhome who might not be aware of the bear's proximity. "Let's see what it does first," Michael replied. "If it comes closer to the campsites, we'll definitely need to alert everyone and call the rangers." The bear's behavior over the next hour would later be described by wildlife experts as highly atypical for the species and season. Instead of moving through the area and continuing on to other territories, it established what appeared to be a watching position on a granite outcropping about 75 yards from the nearest campsite. From this elevated position, it could observe all three camping parties while remaining partially concealed by manzanita bushes and scattered boulders. Dr. Chen, when she later reviewed witness statements and photographic evidence, would identify this behavior as consistent with predatory stalking patterns that were extremely rare in black bears under normal circumstances. Healthy black bears avoid human contact and move through areas quickly when they detect human scent, she would write in her incident analysis report. Extended observation of humans from a concealed position suggests either habituation to human presence, which is dangerous, or metabolic disruption affecting normal fear responses, which is potentially catastrophic. At 6:15 p.m., Ranger Martinez arrived at Wawana Campground for her scheduled patrol, 45 minutes later than planned due to a vehicle breakdown that required roadside assistance on Highway 41. She drove slowly through the camping loops in her patrol vehicle, a modified pickup truck equipped with emergency medical supplies, communication equipment, and wildlife management tools, including bear spray and noise-making devices. Her patrol began with the Peters campsite, where she stopped to follow up on the morning's bear activity report. Harold emerged from the RV as she parked, grateful for the ranger's attention to their concerns. Any further signs of activity since this morning? Ranger Martinez asked, examining the damaged garbage container and photographing the claw marks with her digital camera. We've been keeping an eye out, but haven't seen anything directly, Harold replied, though the folks in the Airstream mentioned they spotted a bear in the woods earlier this afternoon. Ranger Martinez made notes in her logbook and walked the perimeter of the campsite, looking for tracks, scat, or other evidence of bear presence. The rocky soil and thick layer of pine needles made tracking difficult, but she identified several disturbed areas that might have been caused by a large animal. "I'm going to talk with your neighbors and get their account of the sighting," she told Harold. "In the meantime, make sure all your food and scented items are secured inside your RV. We've been seeing more bear activity than usual this winter." The conversation with Dr. and Mrs. Richardson provided more detailed information about the bear's size, behavior, and location. Ranger Martinez made careful notes about the animal's apparent surveillance of the campground, which elevated her concern level significantly. "That's not typical behavior," she admitted to the Richardson family. "Black bears usually avoid areas with human activity, especially during winter months. The fact that it's staying in the area and watching suggests either habituation or some kind of distress." Dr. Richardson shared his professional assessment of the bear's size and condition based on his observations. It appeared healthy and well-fed, not emaciated or obviously injured, but there was something about its behavior that seemed deliberate, almost calculating. Ranger Martinez completed her patrol with a stop at the Hendricks campsite, where Robert provided additional observations from his afternoon spent reading outside their RV. He had noticed the bear's presence, but hadn't thought much of it, assuming it would pass through the area and continue on to other territories. "In 5 years of full-time RVing, we've seen plenty of bears," Robert told the ranger. "This one just seemed more persistent than most. Usually they investigate, maybe test a garbage can or storage box, then move along. This one kept circling back." By 7:30 p.m., Ranger Martinez had completed a thorough assessment of the situation and was faced with a decision that would haunt her professional career, regardless of which option she chose. She could evacuate the campground immediately, disrupting the visitors' plans and potentially overreacting to what might be normal, if unusual, bear behavior. Or she could increase patrols, issue warnings, and monitor the situation closely while allowing the campers to remain. Her training and experience suggested the middle course. She issued verbal warnings to all 3 camping parties, provided them with detailed instructions for bear encounter protocols, and scheduled additional patrol checks every 2 hours throughout the night. She also contacted the park's wildlife management office to request a specialist assessment first thing in the morning. "I want you all to stay in your RVs after dark," she instructed each camping party. "Keep your doors and windows locked, don't put any garbage out tonight, and call the emergency number immediately if you see or hear anything concerning. I'll be back to check on everyone around 9 o'clock and again before midnight." What Ranger Martinez didn't know was that her patrol vehicle's presence and activity had been closely monitored by the bear from its observation position. Wildlife behavioral studies have documented that bears can learn to associate ranger patrols with temporary human vigilance, followed by relaxed security. The bear appeared to settle in to wait for the heightened activity to subside. Dr. Richardson, with his emergency medicine background, took the ranger's warnings seriously and spent the evening reviewing bear encounter protocols with his family. He moved their vehicle closer to their Airstream's door, ensured their cell phones were fully charged, and prepared a basic first aid kit for quick access. His wife Sarah researched bear behavior online using their satellite internet connection, reading everything she could find about black bear attacks and survival strategies. Harold and June Peters responded to the warnings by securing their RV even more thoroughly than before. Harold checked and double-checked every window latch, door lock, and external storage compartment. June moved their most valuable items, including jewelry and important documents, into the RV's safe, an unconscious preparation for the possibility of abandoning their home on wheels. The Hendricks, drawing on their years of camping experience, maintained a calm but alert posture. Robert updated his travel log with detailed notes about the bear sighting and ranger warnings, while Margaret organized their emergency supplies and contacted their adult children to update them on their location and situation. At 8:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Ranger Martinez's scheduled return visit, the bear made its first direct approach to the camping area. Dr. Richardson, who was monitoring the situation through his Airstream's windows, watched the animal emerge from the tree line and move with surprising stealth toward the Peters motorhome. The bear's behavior during this approach would later be analyzed by multiple wildlife experts as exhibiting characteristics more typical of predatory stalking than exploratory investigation. It moved in a low crouch, pausing frequently to test wind direction and sound conditions, and approaching from an angle that would put the RV between itself and the other occupied campsites. Dr. Richardson immediately called the park emergency number, reaching Ranger Martinez's radio just as she was preparing to begin her evening patrol check. "This is Dr. Richardson at Campsite 45, he said quietly into his phone. "The bear is back, and it's approaching the Peters RV right now. This doesn't look like normal behavior." Ranger Martinez, who was approximately 2 miles away dealing with an unrelated incident involving illegal camping, estimated her response time at 8 to 10 minutes. "Can you make some noise to discourage it?" she asked. "Bang some pots, use an air horn if you have one. Don't put yourself at risk, but try to break up whatever it's doing." Dr. Richardson grabbed a metal camping pot and wooden spoon, opened his Airstream's door slightly, and began making loud clanging noises while shouting, "Hey bear, get out of here!" His daughters, frightened by the commotion, pressed their faces to the rear window to watch the unfolding drama. The bear's response to the noise was immediate and alarming. Instead of fleeing, as would be expected from a normal wild black bear, it turned toward the source of the disturbance and stood up on its hind legs. This position, with the bear at its full height of approximately 6 feet, allowed it to locate the source of the sounds and assess the threat level. For nearly 30 seconds, the bear remained standing while Dr. Richardson continued his noise-making efforts. Then, in a move that defied all normal black bear behavioral patterns, the animal dropped to all fours and began moving deliberately toward the Richardson campsite. "It's coming toward us," Dr. Richardson reported urgently into his phone. "This is not normal bear behavior. This animal is not afraid of humans." Sarah Richardson immediately began implementing their emergency plan, gathering their daughters and moving them to the front of the Airstream, while her husband continued monitoring the bear's approach. The family's SUV was parked about 10 feet from their RV's door, and Sarah calculated they could reach it in seconds if necessary. The bear covered the 50 yards between the Peters RV and the Richardson campsite in approximately 2 minutes, moving with the confident gait of an animal that had overcome its natural fear of humans. As it approached the Airstream, it began what wildlife experts would later describe as investigative behavior, circling the trailer, testing different surfaces with its claws, and attempting to locate entry points. Dr. Richardson found himself in the surreal position of providing real-time commentary on an animal attack to a park ranger who was still several minutes away. "It's scratching at our trailer walls," he reported. "Testing the door handle. My God, it's trying to figure out how to get in." The sound of claws scraping against aluminum siding was clearly audible to everyone inside the Airstream. Emma and Sophie Richardson, 12-year-old twins who had never experienced anything more threatening than a classroom fire drill, clung to their mother while their father tried to balance his role as protector with his professional obligation to gather information that might help with emergency response. "Can you get to your vehicle?" Ranger Martinez asked through the phone connection. Dr. Richardson assessed the situation quickly. The bear was between their trailer door and their SUV, making a direct run impossible. However, the Airstream had a rear emergency exit that might provide access to a different escape route. "Maybe through the back emergency exit," he replied, "but that would put us on foot in the woods with this thing between us and any help." "Stay put for now," the ranger instructed. "I'm 3 minutes out, and I'm calling for additional backup." Meanwhile, Harold and June Peters remained unaware of the drama unfolding 50 yards from their RV. Their luxury motorhome's thick walls and efficient sound insulation blocked most external noise, and they were watching television in their climate-controlled interior. Harold had checked the exterior cameras mounted on their RV at 8:30 p.m. and seen nothing unusual, but the camera system's night vision capabilities were limited and wouldn't detect an animal moving stealthily between the trees. The bear's investigation of the Richardson's Airstream lasted approximately 8 minutes, during which time it tested every accessible surface, door and window. Dr. Richardson documented its behavior in clinical detail, noting the systematic nature of its exploration and the complete absence of fear or startle responses that would be expected from a wild animal. "It's treating our trailer like a puzzle to be solved," he reported to Ranger Martinez. "This isn't random exploration, it's problem-solving behavior." At 9:02 p.m., the bear abandoned its investigation of the Airstream and moved toward the Hendricks Class A motorhome. Robert and Margaret had been monitoring the situation through their windows and radio communications, preparing for the animal's potential approach to their campsite. Robert Hendricks, drawing on his insurance background and methodical nature, had spent the previous hour documenting everything he observed about the bear's behavior, size, and condition. His notes would later provide crucial evidence for wildlife investigators trying to understand the animal's psychological state and motivation. "It's definitely not acting like any bear we've seen before," he reported to his wife as they watched the animal approach their RV. "This thing is conducting reconnaissance." The bear's investigation of the Hendricks motorhome followed a similar pattern to its examination of the Airstream, but with increased intensity and persistence. Margaret noted that the animal seemed to be learning from each encounter, applying knowledge gained from previous investigations to develop more effective exploration techniques. At 9:07 p.m., Ranger Martinez arrived at the campground with her vehicle's emergency lights activated and her bear deterrent equipment readily accessible. The sight of the ranger's truck had an immediate effect on the bear, which ceased its investigation of the Hendricks RV and retreated approximately 20 yards toward the tree line. However, instead of continuing its retreat into the wilderness, the bear took up a position where it could observe the ranger's activities while remaining partially concealed. This behavior, tactical withdrawal followed by continued surveillance, represented another significant deviation from normal black bear responses to official human presence. Ranger Martinez's assessment of the situation confirmed her worst fears. The bear was exhibiting multiple indicators of habituation to humans, lack of normal fear responses, and problem-solving behavior that suggested it viewed the campsites not as areas to avoid, but as resources to be exploited. "This animal needs to be relocated immediately," she radioed to her dispatch center. "We're dealing with a habituated bear that's showing predatory investigation behavior. I need wildlife management and additional ranger support as soon as possible. Deal." The response from park headquarters was complicated by the late hour and limited availability of specialized personnel. The park's senior wildlife biologist was off duty and wouldn't be available until morning. The nearest wildlife management team was based in Fresno, approximately 90 minutes away, and couldn't be mobilized until a formal threat assessment was completed. Ranger Martinez found herself facing a decision that exceeded her training and experience. She could order an immediate evacuation of the campground, which would require coordination with multiple agencies and might not be possible in complete safety with the bear maintaining its surveillance position. Or she could establish a protective presence until morning, when additional resources would be available. Her decision was influenced by the bear's current behavior, which appeared to be investigative rather than immediately aggressive, and by the practical challenges of moving elderly campers and large RVs in darkness with a potentially dangerous animal in the area. "I'm going to maintain a presence here through the night," she decided. "All campers need to remain inside their vehicles with doors and windows locked. No one goes outside for any reason. I'll coordinate with dispatch to have wildlife management here first thing in the morning." This decision, while reasonable given the available information and resources, created the conditions that would lead to the tragedy that followed. The bear, rather than being deterred by the ranger's presence, appeared to interpret the official response as confirmation that the campground contained valuable resources worth defending and exploiting. Dr. Richardson, drawing on his medical training and crisis management experience, volunteered to serve as a communication coordinator between the three camping parties and the ranger. His emergency medicine background had taught him the importance of clear information flow during developing crisis situations. "I can maintain radio contact with everyone and coordinate any medical response if needed," he offered. "My wife and I are both emergency physicians, so we have supplies and training that might be helpful." Ranger Martinez accepted the offer gratefully, recognizing that Dr. Richardson's professional background made him better qualified than anyone else present to assess and respond to potential injuries. They established a communication protocol using cell phones and park radio frequencies that would allow immediate response to any emergency. The three camping parties settled in for what everyone hoped would be an uneventful night of waiting for professional wildlife management assistance. Harold and June Peters, finally informed of the situation's seriousness, secured their RV and prepared to maintain an all-night vigil. The Hendricks positioned themselves where they could monitor the bear's location while staying safely inside their vehicle. The Richardson family organized their emergency supplies and prepared for the possibility of rapid evacuation. At 10:30 p.m., the bear made a significant behavioral shift. Instead of maintaining its surveillance position, it began a systematic exploration of the campground's infrastructure, testing garbage containers, picnic tables, fire rings, and utility connections with increasing boldness and persistence. Ranger Martinez observed this behavior with growing alarm, recognizing that the bear was exhibiting territorial marking and claiming behaviors rather than simple curiosity. The animal was treating the campground as its own territory, and the human occupants as intruders to be monitored and potentially challenged. "This is escalating beyond a normal wildlife encounter," she radioed to her dispatch. "I need immediate support and authorization for lethal wildlife management if necessary." The response from park headquarters reflected the complex legal and practical considerations involved in wildlife management decisions. Lethal action against park wildlife required extensive documentation, supervisory approval, and consideration of alternative methods. The bear hadn't yet demonstrated direct aggressive behavior toward humans, making lethal intervention difficult to justify under existing policies. At 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Ranger Martinez's planned midnight patrol check, the bear's behavior escalated dramatically. It approached the Peters motorhome and began what can only be described as a systematic attempt to gain entry to the vehicle. Harold Peters, monitoring the situation through his RV's security camera system, watched in horror as the bear examined every external storage compartment, tested window latches, and began scratching at the entry door's weather sealing. The sound of claws on fiberglass and metal was clearly audible inside the RV, creating a terrifying soundtrack to their enforced captivity. "It's trying to break in," Harold reported to Dr. Richardson, who immediately relayed the information to Ranger Martinez. "This thing is not going to give up." June Peters, experiencing the worst fear of her 71 years, clutched her husband's arm while they watched their expensive dream home being systematically attacked by an animal that seemed to understand exactly what it was doing. The bear's investigation was methodical and persistent, focusing on potential entry points with the problem-solving ability of an intelligent predator. The attack on the RV's exterior continued for over 20 minutes, during which time the bear tested every accessible surface, component, and potential vulnerability. It discovered that the RV's awning mechanism could be manipulated, that certain storage compartments had slightly loose latches, and that the entry door's construction included weak points where the frame connected to the main body. Dr. Richardson, monitoring the situation from his airstream, provided real-time assessment of the bear's behavior and capabilities. "It's learning," he reported to Ranger Martinez. "Each time it tests something and doesn't get the result it wants, it tries a different approach. This is sophisticated problem-solving behavior." At 12:15 a.m. on February 5th, the bear made a discovery that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. While investigating the RV's rear storage compartments, it found that one of the latches hadn't engaged properly when Harold secured the campsite earlier that evening. The compartment contained outdoor furniture, camping supplies, and most critically, a cooler with beverages that had been inadvertently left outside the main RV. The bear's successful opening of the storage compartment was immediately audible to everyone in the area. The sound of the metal latch releasing, followed by the crash of falling equipment and the bear's excited vocalizations, marked the moment when the situation transitioned from tense standoff to active emergency. "It's in our storage compartment," Harold reported, his voice tight with fear and anger. "That cooler has sodas and sports drinks. Once it gets a reward for breaking in, it's going to keep trying." Wildlife behavior experts would later confirm Harold's instinctive understanding of the situation. Bears that successfully obtain food rewards from human sources become increasingly bold and persistent in their efforts to repeat the experience. The successful break-in would reinforce the bear's perception of the RV as a valuable resource worth defending and exploiting. Ranger Martinez, recognizing that the situation had crossed a critical threshold, made the decision to intervene directly. She approached the Peters campsite with her vehicle's spotlight activated and began using air horns, shouting, and other deterrent methods to disrupt the bear's feeding behavior. The bear's response to the ranger's intervention was immediate and alarming. Instead of fleeing, it stood up on its hind legs, vocalized aggressively, and positioned itself between the ranger and the RV in what wildlife experts would later identify as resource-guarding behavior. "This bear is defending the campsite as its territory," Ranger Martinez radioed to her dispatch. "I repeat, we have a territorial bear that's claiming human resources. I need immediate backup and wildlife management authorization for lethal intervention." The standoff between Ranger Martinez and the bear lasted approximately 10 minutes, during which time the animal demonstrated that it had no intention of abandoning what it now considered its food source. The bear's body language and vocalizations indicated increasing agitation and willingness to defend its claimed territory against human interference. At 12:35 a.m., the bear made the tactical decision that would lead directly to the tragedy that followed. Rather than continuing the standoff with the ranger, it moved to a position where it could access the RV while keeping the ranger's vehicle at a distance. This flanking maneuver demonstrated spatial reasoning and strategic thinking that exceeded normal black bear cognitive capabilities. Harold and June Peters, trapped inside their luxury motorhome, found themselves at the center of a developing crisis that their suburban lives and careful planning had never prepared them for. Their RV, designed to provide comfort and security during retirement travels, had become a fortress under siege by an adversary they had no training or equipment to handle. "What do we do?" June asked her husband, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bears' continued investigation of their vehicle's exterior. "How do we get out of here?" Harold's engineering background had taught him to approach problems systematically, breaking complex challenges into manageable components. But this situation defied rational analysis. They were trapped inside a vehicle that, despite its size and weight, was proving vulnerable to a determined animal attack. Their communications were limited to cell phones, their defensive options were non-existent, and their escape routes were blocked by the very animal they needed to avoid. "We wait," Harold decided. "The ranger knows where we are, help is coming, and this thing can't actually get inside. We just have to wait it out." This assessment, while reasonable given the available information, failed to account for the bears' growing frustration and the RV's design limitations when faced with a persistent, intelligent attacker. The vehicle's construction, while more than adequate for weather, road hazards, and normal camping challenges, had never been tested against a motivated predator. At 1:20 a.m., 45 minutes after Ranger Martinez had requested emergency backup, the bear made the breakthrough that sealed the Peters' fate. While investigating the RV's entry door for the 12th time, it discovered that sustained pressure on the door frame caused a slight separation between the door and the weather sealing. The bear's investigation of this weakness was methodical and persistent. It applied increasing pressure to the door frame, testing the limits of the construction materials and hardware. The sound of straining metal and cracking fiberglass was clearly audible to Harold and June, who realized with growing horror that their home's defenses were beginning to fail. "The door is giving way," Harold reported to Dr. Richardson. "This animal is going to get inside." Dr. Richardson immediately relayed this information to Ranger Martinez, who was positioned approximately 30 yards away and attempting to coordinate the response of backup units that were still en route. The situation had evolved beyond her training and equipment capabilities, but she remained the only official response available to the trapped campers. "Can you get to a secure area inside your RV?" the ranger asked through the radio connection. "Bathroom, bedroom, anywhere with a solid door you can lock?" Harold's mental inventory of their RV's interior revealed the fundamental design flaw that would prove fatal. The luxury motorhome's open floor plan, which had been a selling point for its spacious feeling and ease of movement, offered no interior doors or secure areas that could provide protection from an intruder. "It's all open," Harold reported. "There's nowhere to hide." The final phase of the bears' assault on the RV began at 1:35 a.m. and lasted approximately 12 minutes. Using a combination of brute force and problem-solving intelligence, the animal systematically dismantled the entry door's integrity until it achieved enough of an opening to force entry into the vehicle. The sounds of the break-in were captured on the RV's internal security system, creating an audio record that would later be analyzed by multiple agencies and wildlife experts. The progression from scratching and testing to sustained assault to final breakthrough documented the bear's persistent intelligence and determination. Harold and June Peters spent their final minutes together implementing the only defensive strategy available to them. Harold positioned himself between his wife and the compromised entry door, armed with a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher. June attempted to contact their adult children, wanting to hear their voices one last time and to express her love for them. At 1:47 a.m., the bear achieved sufficient opening of the entry door to enter the RV. What followed was documented through 911 call recordings, witness statements from the other campers, and physical evidence that would later be analyzed by forensic investigators. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but the sounds carried clearly to the other campsites. Dr. Richardson, monitoring the situation with his medical training and emergency response experience, provided real-time assessment of what was occurring to Ranger Martinez and the incoming backup units. "We need immediate medical response," he reported. "This is no longer a wildlife management situation. This is a medical emergency." Sarah Richardson, despite her husband's attempts to shield her from the sounds, recognized the audio signature of severe trauma from her years in pediatric emergency medicine. The combination of human screams, animal vocalizations, and the sounds of destruction painted a clear picture of the violence occurring inside the luxury motorhome. Ranger Martinez, faced with an active attack in progress and no backup yet on scene, made the decision to intervene directly despite the risks to her own safety. She approached the compromised RV with her sidearm drawn and began shouting commands at the bear while preparing to use lethal force if necessary. The bear's response to the ranger's approach was to defend its kill site against the perceived threat. It emerged from the RV covered in blood and displaying the aggressive posturing of a predator protecting its prey. The animal had crossed the psychological barrier that separates opportunistic scavenging from active predation of humans. Ranger Martinez fired 4 shots from her service weapon, a .40 caliber Glock 22, hitting the bear multiple times center mass. The animal's response to being shot demonstrated the altered state of consciousness that had characterized its behavior throughout the encounter. Instead of fleeing or immediately collapsing, it continued its aggressive posturing and attempted to charge the ranger's position. A 5th shot, aimed at the bear's head from a distance of approximately 15 feet, ended the animal's life and the immediate threat to the remaining campers. The bear collapsed less than 10 feet from where Ranger Martinez had positioned herself, its final moments occurring at 1:52 a.m. on February 5th. The silence that followed the shooting was broken only by the crackling of Ranger Martinez's radio as backup units reported their arrival times and requested status updates. Dr. Richardson, despite the ranger's instructions to remain in his vehicle, began preparing his medical supplies for what he knew would be a complex trauma response. "I'm going to need access to the Peters," he radioed. "If anyone survived that attack, they're going to need immediate medical intervention." Ranger Martinez's first priority was confirming that the bear was dead and ensuring no additional threats to the surviving campers. Her examination of the animal revealed a large adult female black bear, estimated at approximately 280 pounds, in excellent physical condition except for the gunshot wounds. There were no obvious signs of disease, injury, or malnutrition that might explain its aberrant behavior. The approach to the compromised RV required careful assessment of both the structural damage and the potential for additional hazards. The bear's break-in had severely damaged the entry door and frame, making the interior accessible but potentially unstable. Dr. Richardson, despite having no tactical training, accompanied Ranger Martinez as they approached the vehicle. The scene inside the motorhome would later be described by investigating officers as among the worst they had encountered in over 20 years of law enforcement. The bear's attack had been concentrated in the RV's main living area, where Harold and June Peters had attempted their final defense. The luxury interior had been transformed into a chaotic landscape of blood, broken furniture, and scattered personal belongings. Dr. Richardson's medical assessment confirmed what the sounds of the attack had suggested. Both Harold and June Peters had sustained massive trauma that was incompatible with survival. His examination, conducted with the clinical detachment that emergency physicians develop for such situations, documented the extent of the injuries for the official investigation that would follow. "No survivors," he reported to Ranger Martinez. "Both victims sustained multiple traumatic injuries. Time of death approximately 1:50 a.m. The remainder of the night was devoted to securing the scene. coordinating the response of multiple agencies and providing support for the surviving campers who had witnessed the tragedy. The Hendricks and the Richardson families would require extensive debriefing and counseling to process the trauma they had experienced. At 3:15 a.m., the first of what would become a massive multi-agency response began arriving at Wawona Campground. The California Highway Patrol, Mariposa County Sheriff's Office, National Park Service Investigative Services, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife would all ultimately be involved in the investigation and response to the incident. The initial investigation focused on documenting the scene, collecting physical evidence, and interviewing the surviving witnesses. Dr. Richardson's professional background made him a particularly valuable witness, as his medical training had allowed him to observe and document details that civilian witnesses might have missed or misunderstood. The bear's carcass was transported to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Laboratory in Sacramento for complete necropsy and analysis. Dr. Chen, the state's bear behavior expert, was brought in to conduct the behavioral analysis and determine what factors might have contributed to the animal's aberrant conduct. The Peters motorhome, valued at approximately $900,000, was declared a total loss due to both the structural damage caused by the bear's break-in and the biological contamination resulting from the attack. The vehicle would eventually be transported to a specialized facility for complete destruction, as no cleaning or restoration could make it suitable for future use. The news media response to the incident began within hours of the attack, as word of the tragedy spread through law enforcement and Park Service communications. By dawn on February 5th, news crews were en route to Yosemite, and the story was beginning to spread through social media and online news platforms. The investigation's preliminary findings, released at a press conference on February 7th, confirmed that the bear's behavior had been highly unusual and represented a significant deviation from normal black bear interactions with humans. However, the question of what had caused this behavioral change remained under investigation. Dr. Chen's analysis of the bear's tissues revealed elevated stress hormones consistent with disrupted hibernation patterns, but no evidence of disease, toxins, or other obvious causes for the aggressive behavior. The bear appeared to have been a healthy adult female that had, for unknown reasons, lost its natural fear of humans and developed territorial behavior around the campground. The necropsy did reveal that the bear was not pregnant, eliminating one potential explanation for protective maternal behavior. The animal's stomach contents showed evidence of the drinks and snacks it had obtained from the Peters RV storage compartment, but also included natural food sources, indicating it was not desperately hungry. The surviving campers were relocated to hotels in nearby towns while providing statements to investigators and beginning the psychological treatment that would be necessary to process their trauma. The Richardson family, despite Dr. Michael's professional experience with trauma cases, found themselves struggling with the emotional impact of having witnessed the attack and been unable to prevent it. Robert and Margaret Hendricks, whose camping experience had exposed them to various wildlife encounters, described the bear's behavior as unlike anything they had previously observed. Robert's detailed logs of the incident provided investigators with precise timelines and behavioral observations that proved invaluable for understanding the sequence of events. The National Park Service faced immediate questions about their wildlife management policies, ranger training, and emergency response procedures. Critics argued that the warning signs had been present and that earlier intervention could have prevented the tragedy. Park officials defended their response as appropriate given the information available at the time. The incident prompted immediate changes to park policies regarding bear activity reporting and response. New protocols were implemented requiring enhanced patrols when any signs of aberrant bear behavior were reported, and rangers received additional training in wildlife threat assessment and response. The Peters adult children, Michael Peters of Portland, Oregon, and Jennifer Peters Williams of Sacramento, California, arrived at Yosemite on February 6th to identify their parents' remains and begin the complex process of settling their estate. The couple had been living their retirement dream, traveling full-time in their luxury motorhome, when their lives were cut short by an encounter with a predator that defied all normal behavioral patterns. Funeral services for Harold and June Peters were held on February 12th in Bellevue, Washington, where they had lived for 47 years before beginning their RV adventure. The service was attended by hundreds of former colleagues, neighbors, students, and friends who remembered them as devoted educators and community volunteers. The couple's RV lifestyle had been documented through a blog and social media accounts that had attracted thousands of followers who enjoyed living vicariously through their adventures. The final entry, posted by Harold on February 4th, included photos of the Yosemite sunrise and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to experience America's natural wonders. The investigation into the incident continued for several months, with wildlife experts, behavioral scientists, and law enforcement officials working to understand what had caused a normally reclusive species to exhibit predatory behavior toward humans. The findings would have implications for wildlife management policies throughout North America. Dr. Chen's final report, published 6 months after the incident, concluded that climate change-related disruption of hibernation patterns had created conditions where bears might exhibit unpredictable and potentially dangerous behavior. She recommended enhanced monitoring of bear populations during winter months and revised protocols for human-wildlife conflict response. The National Park Service implemented new policies requiring immediate evacuation of camping areas when bears exhibit any signs of territorial or predatory behavior. The threshold for determining when lethal wildlife management is necessary was also lowered to prioritize human safety over wildlife conservation in extreme situations. Ranger Martinez, despite being cleared of any wrongdoing in the incident, requested transfer to a different park where she could continue her career without the constant reminder of the tragedy she had been unable to prevent. Her final report included recommendations for enhanced training and equipment for park rangers who might face similar situations. The Wawona campground was closed for the remainder of the winter season, while the Park Service reviewed and revised their wildlife management protocols. When it reopened in spring, enhanced bear-proof storage requirements and mandatory educational programs were implemented for all campers. The Richardson family returned to their home in Denver, where Dr. Michael and Sarah resumed their emergency medicine careers with a deeper understanding of how quickly routine situations can evolve into life-threatening crises. They continued to camp and travel, but their experience at Yosemite had permanently altered their approach to wilderness safety and risk assessment. Emma and Sophie Richardson, the 12-year-old twins who had witnessed the tragedy, received counseling to help them process the trauma of the experience. Their parents worked with child psychologists to ensure that the incident didn't create permanent fear of nature or outdoor activities that had previously been a source of family enjoyment. Robert and Margaret Hendricks continued their full-time RV lifestyle, but implemented enhanced safety protocols based on their experience at Yosemite. Robert's detailed documentation of the incident became part of a wilderness safety presentation he began giving at RV rallies and camping events throughout the country. The incident at Yosemite became a case study used in wildlife management programs, emergency response training, and risk assessment courses throughout North America. The detailed documentation provided by the witnesses and investigators created an unprecedented record of predatory bear behavior that informed policy changes and training programs. Insurance investigations into the incident focused on both the Peters life insurance claims and the total loss of their expensive motorhome. The unique circumstances of the attack raised questions about coverage exclusions and prompted some insurers to revise their policies regarding wildlife-related incidents. The legal implications of the incident included wrongful death lawsuits filed by the Peters family against the National Park Service and potential liability issues related to the campground's safety protocols. These cases would take years to resolve and would ultimately influence how government agencies approach wildlife management decisions. Media coverage of the incident continued for months, with documentaries, magazine articles, and books examining both the specific circumstances of the attack and the broader implications for human-wildlife interactions in an era of climate change. The story became a cautionary tale about the unpredictability of wild animals and the limitations of safety protocols. The scientific community's analysis of the incident contributed to a growing body of research on how environmental changes are affecting wildlife behavior. The bear's aberrant conduct became part of studies examining the connections between climate disruption, ecosystem changes, and animal psychology. Memorial funds established in Harold and June Peters' memory supported wildlife research and camping safety education programs. Their tragic death became part of ongoing efforts to prevent similar incidents while preserving the wilderness experiences they had been seeking. The Newell coach that had been their dream home was eventually dismantled and destroyed. Its expensive components and luxury amenities no match for the primitive fury of a wild animal driven by instincts that science was still struggling to understand. The $900,000 investment in retirement comfort had become a monument to the illusion of security in an increasingly unpredictable world. The incident's impact extended far beyond the immediate participants, influencing park policies, wildlife management protocols, insurance practices, and public perception of wilderness safety. It became a watershed moment that forced a re-evaluation of how humans interact with wild spaces and the animals that inhabit them. In the months that followed, Dr. Chen continued her research into climate-related changes in bear behavior, using data from the Yosemite incident to support funding for expanded monitoring and research programs. Her work contributed to a growing understanding of how environmental disruption was creating unpredictable risks for both wildlife and humans. The tragedy at Yosemite served as a stark reminder that wilderness experiences, no matter how carefully planned or expensively equipped, carry inherent risks that can never be completely eliminated. Harold and June Peters had sought adventure and natural beauty in their retirement years, but they encountered instead the raw, unforgiving reality of predatory nature. Their story became part of the larger narrative of human expansion into wild spaces and the complex challenges of coexistence with the animals that have called those places home for millennia. The luxury RV that was supposed to provide them with safe, comfortable access to America's natural wonders had instead become their tomb, destroyed by a creature operating according to instincts older than civilization itself. The investigation's final conclusion was that the bear's behavior, while highly unusual, represented an extreme example of how environmental stresses can alter wildlife behavior in unpredictable ways. The incident served as a wake-up call for wildlife managers, park officials, and outdoor enthusiasts about the need for enhanced vigilance and improved response protocols in an era of rapid environmental change. Years later, the site where Harold and June Peters died would be marked only by the return of natural vegetation and the quiet presence of the wilderness they had come to experience. Their story lived on in the policies, procedures, and precautions that were implemented to prevent similar tragedies, a legacy born of loss but dedicated to the protection of future generations of wilderness visitors. The bear that killed them was buried in an unmarked grave, its carcass providing final contributions to scientific understanding through tissue samples and behavioral analysis. It had lived and died according to instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution, unaware that its actions would reshape how humans approach the wild spaces where such encounters remain an ever-present possibility. The February 5th, 2025 incident at Yosemite National Park became more than just a wildlife attack. It became a symbol of humanity's complex and sometimes fatal relationship with the natural world, a reminder that even our most careful preparations and expensive equipment cannot eliminate the fundamental risks of venturing into spaces where we are not the dominant predator. The next stories. January 16th, 2025. Grizzly Malls. Snowmobile riders in Montana, 2 killed January 16, 2025. Grizzly Malls snowmobile riders in Montana, 2 killed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine snowfields surrounding Flathead Lake, Montana, as Tyler James Grant adjusted his helmet strap and fired up his Arctic Cat Thundercat 9000. The engine's roar echoed across the frozen landscape, a sound that would haunt the memories of those who knew him for years to come. At 22 years old, Tyler was a junior at Montana State University, studying mechanical engineering. His sandy brown hair always seemed to escape from under whatever hat he wore, and his infectious laugh had carried him through 4 years of friendship with his roommate Jason Miller. Tyler's blue eyes sparkled with the same excitement they'd held since childhood whenever adventure called, though today that excitement would lead him into a confrontation with one of nature's most formidable predators. Jason David Miller, also 22 and a business major with dreams of opening his own outdoor equipment store, sat astride his matching Ski-Doo MXZ XRS 850, checking his GPS coordinates one final time. His methodical nature had always balanced Tyler's impulsiveness perfectly. Where Tyler would leap first and look later, Jason planned every detail, which made their friendship work so seamlessly. Jason's dark hair was already showing frost from his breath in the -15-degree morning air, and his brown eyes scanned the terrain ahead with the careful attention of someone who'd grown up in these mountains. His father, Robert Miller, had been a forest ranger for 30 years before retiring, and Jason had absorbed countless hours of wilderness wisdom sitting around their family's kitchen table. Today, that wisdom would prove insufficient against the primal fury they were about to encounter. The two friends had driven up from Bozeman the previous evening, their pickup truck loaded with their snowmobiles and enough gear for a 3-day backcountry expedition. They'd parked at the Lost Horse Trail staging area, coordinates 47.9721 degrees north, 114.2891 degrees west, elevation 4,200 feet, where the Forest Service maintained a small parking area and loading dock for winter recreationists. The area was a gateway to over 50,000 acres of pristine wilderness in the Flathead National Forest, crisscrossed with unmarked trails that meandered through dense stands of lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and western larch. The terrain rose gradually from the lake's eastern shore, climbing through a series of ridgelines and alpine meadows that in summer blazed with wildflowers but now lay buried under 6 feet of accumulated snow. Their campsite sat on a small ridge overlooking the lake, sheltered by a grove of massive ponderosa pines whose thick bark showed the black scars of old forest fires. Tyler had chosen the spot the previous afternoon for its commanding view and protection from the prevailing westerly winds that swept across the lake's frozen surface. Their 2-man mountaineering tent, a North Face VE25 rated for extreme conditions, had been anchored with snow pickets and guy lines, creating a small bubble of warmth and safety in the vast wilderness. A camp kitchen set up with a Coleman dual-burner stove occupied a wind-screened area between 2 large rocks, while their food hung in bear canisters suspended 15 feet off the ground and 200 feet from their sleeping area, exactly as Forest Service regulations required. The weather forecast had called for clear skies and temperatures ranging from -20 at night to -5 during the day, perfect conditions for snowmobiling but challenging enough to test their skills and equipment. A high-pressure system had settled over the region, bringing the crystalline clarity that made winter in the northern Rockies so spectacular and so dangerous. The barometric pressure read 30.45 inches of mercury on Jason's altimeter watch, indicating stable conditions that could hold for several days. Wind speeds were forecast to remain light, under 10 miles per hour, though the morning air was so still that their voices seemed to carry for miles across the silent landscape. They'd spent the evening of January 15th reviewing their planned route over steaming cups of instant coffee laced with Bailey's Irish cream that Tyler had smuggled along, despite Jason's protests about alcohol and cold weather safety. Their maps, printed on waterproof paper and marked with GPS waypoints, showed a 30-mile loop that would take them up the Lost Horse Creek drainage, over Panorama Ridge at 6,800 feet elevation, and back down through the remote Whitefish Creek Valley. The route included several known avalanche paths that they'd planned to cross quickly during the most stable part of the day, between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., when solar warming had not yet destabilized the snowpack, but visibility remained optimal. Tyler had been snowmobiling since he was 12 years old, when his grandfather had taught him to ride on an old Polaris Indy 500 on the family's ranch outside Billings. Over the intervening decade, he'd upgraded through a series of machines, always favoring the high-performance models that could climb seemingly impossible terrain and carve turns in powder snow like a skier. His current sled, the Arctic Cat Thundercat, represented the pinnacle of snowmobile engineering, with its turbocharged four-stroke engine producing 200 horsepower, electronically controlled suspension, and track designed specifically for deep powder riding. Tyler had modified the machine extensively, adding a custom exhaust system, upgraded suspension components, and GPS navigation equipment that cost more than many people's cars. Jason's approach to snowmobiling was more practical but no less skilled. His Ski-Doo MXZ represented the perfect balance of performance and reliability, with enough power to keep up with Tyler's adventures, but with the dependability needed for backcountry travel where mechanical failure could prove fatal. Jason carried a comprehensive toolkit that included spare belts, plugs, and emergency repair supplies, along with a satellite communicator that could summon help from anywhere in North America. His methodical preparation had saved them on previous trips, when Tyler's aggressive riding style had resulted in mechanical problems or route-finding errors. Both young men wore the latest in winter riding gear, layered systems designed to keep them warm and dry in the most extreme conditions, while allowing the mobility needed for athletic riding. Their helmets were DOT-approved models with heated face shields and built-in communication systems that allowed them to talk while riding. Each carried a beacon for avalanche rescue, probe and shovel, first aid kit, emergency shelter, and enough food and water for 3 days of self-sufficiency. Their bright-colored riding suits would make them visible from aircraft if rescue became necessary. Though both confident in their abilities and familiar with the terrain, they expected no such drama. The temperature at sunrise on January 16th measured -18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that their breath formed instant ice crystals that tinkled to the ground like tiny wind chimes. The air was so clear that they could see individual trees on the far shore of Flathead Lake, over 20 miles away. Snow conditions appeared perfect, with 18 inches of fresh powder from a storm 3 days earlier lying atop a solid base that had accumulated throughout December and early January. Avalanche danger was rated as considerable on north-facing slopes above 6,000 feet, but their planned route would keep them primarily on southerly aspects and ridge lines, where wind and sun exposure had stabilized the snowpack. At precisely 8:30 a.m., both machines roared to life, their engines warming up in clouds of steam that rose into the crystal-clear morning air. Tyler's Thundercat settled into the distinctive rumble of its turbocharged engine, while Jason's Ski-Doo purred with the smooth consistency that had made it his choice for backcountry travel. They'd agreed to maintain radio contact throughout the day, checking in every 30 minutes, and immediately if they encountered any problems. Their GPS units were synchronized with identical waypoints, and each carried detailed topographic maps as backup in case of electronic failure. The first leg of their journey took them north from their campsite along an established trail that followed the contours of Lost Horse Ridge. The trail was well marked with orange diamonds nailed to trees every few hundred yards, maintained by the local snowmobile club in cooperation with the Forest Service. Snow depth varied from 4 to 8 feet depending on wind exposure, with the deepest accumulations in sheltered draws and the shallowest on exposed ridgelines where wind had scoured the surface down to a wind-packed crust. Tyler led the way, his riding style immediately evident as he carved sweeping turns through the powder, sending up clouds of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sunlight. His machine responded to every input with precision, the track gripping and releasing with the rhythm of a dancer. Jason followed at a safe distance, maintaining the spacing that would prevent collision if Tyler encountered an obstacle or needed to stop suddenly. Their communication system crackled with intermittent conversation, mostly exclamations of joy at the perfect conditions and spectacular scenery. By 9:15 a.m., they had covered the first 5 miles of their planned route, climbing steadily through increasingly dense forest. The trail wound between massive old-growth trees whose trunks were over 4 feet in diameter, survivors of countless forest fires and winter storms. Snow clung to every branch and needle, creating a winter wonderland that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Wildlife sign was abundant, with tracks of elk, deer and moose visible in the fresh snow, along with the smaller prints of snowshoe hares, martens, and the occasional lynx. Neither young man noticed the larger tracks that paralleled their route 50 yards to the east, partially obscured by wind-blown snow, but clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The tracks belonged to an adult female grizzly bear, approximately 8 years old and weighing 380 pounds, who had emerged from her winter den 3 days earlier following an unusually warm spell that had briefly melted snow at the den entrance. This bear, designated as Bear number 247 in the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks database, had been radio-collared 2 years earlier following conflicts with humans in the Many Glacier area of Glacier National Park. The bear's history was well documented in wildlife management files. She had been born in 2017 to a sow known as Bear number 184, who had been killed by a vehicle on Highway 2 when 247 was still a yearling. The orphaned cub had been captured and relocated twice during her second year before learning to avoid human contact and establishing a territory in the remote areas east of Flathead Lake. Her radio collar had failed the previous spring, leaving her movements unmonitored for the first time in 2 years. During the summer of 2024, she had mated for the first time and given birth to 2 cubs in her winter den, located in a natural cave beneath a massive deadfall of lodgepole pines killed by mountain pine beetles. The timing of her emergence from hibernation was unusual, but not unprecedented. A brief warming trend the previous week, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees, had melted snow around her den entrance and possibly awakened her maternal instincts to check on conditions outside. With 2 3-month-old cubs dependent on her for protection and warmth, she had ventured only short distances from the den site, foraging for any available food sources and ensuring the area remained safe for her offspring. The sound of approaching snowmobiles had triggered every protective instinct evolution had provided. At 9:47 a.m., Tyler's GPS showed them reaching waypoint 3 of their planned route, a junction where their trail intersected with an old logging road that climbed toward Panorama Ridge. The road had been abandoned since the 1970s, when environmental concerns ended logging operations in this part of the national forest, but it provided an excellent snowmobile route through terrain that would otherwise be nearly impossible to navigate. Tyler stopped his machine and waited for Jason to catch up, both removing their helmets to enjoy the absolute silence of the winter wilderness. "This is incredible," Tyler called out, his voice seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I can't believe we have this whole place to ourselves." Jason consulted his GPS and maps, calculating their progress and fuel consumption. "We're making good time. If we maintain this pace, we'll reach the ridge by noon and have plenty of time to explore before heading back." He pointed toward a series of cornices visible on the skyline above them. "Look at those snow formations up there. The wind must really howl across that ridge." What neither of them realized was that the old logging road they were about to ascend passed directly over the grizzly bear's den site. The den was located beneath a massive tangle of dead trees that had fallen during a windstorm 5 years earlier, creating a natural cave system that provided perfect insulation and protection. 6 feet of accumulated snow had completely obscured the entrance, making the location invisible to anyone passing overhead. The bear had excavated a breathing hole and emergency exit that emerged 30 yards away, but these too were hidden beneath the pristine snow surface. At 10:05 a.m., they began the ascent of the abandoned logging road, their machines working harder as the grade increased to nearly 15% in some sections. The trail switchbacked up the mountainside, following the path of least resistance through terrain that dropped off steeply on both sides. Tyler's Thundercat handled the climb effortlessly, its turbocharged engine providing seemingly unlimited power even at the 5,800-foot elevation they had now reached. Jason's Ski-Doo worked harder but maintained pace, its reliable 4-stroke engine designed specifically for this type of demanding backcountry travel. The forest began to change character as they climbed, with the massive old-growth trees giving way to smaller lodgepole pines and stands of aspen, whose white bark stood out starkly against the snow. These were the forests of the subalpine zone, adapted to shorter growing seasons and harsher winters. Many of the trees showed the reddish needles characteristic of mountain pine beetle damage, creating standing forests of dead timber that posed both avalanche and fire hazards but provided excellent wildlife habitat for species adapted to such conditions. At 10:23 a.m., Tyler's machine began to labor slightly as they approached a particularly steep section where the trail curved around a large rockfall. He downshifted and increased throttle, the track spinning momentarily on the steep grade before finding purchase and propelling him forward. Jason followed closely, noting how the snow conditions were changing with elevation, becoming lighter and more wind-affected as they approached treeline. The grizzly bear, meanwhile, had been tracking their progress through vibrations transmitted through the ground and the increasing volume of engine noise. Her acute hearing, capable of detecting sounds at frequencies well beyond human perception, had been monitoring the approaching machines for over 30 minutes. Her cubs, still nursing and completely dependent on her protection, had begun to whimper and cry as the noise increased, triggering every maternal protective instinct in her powerful body. Bears emerging from hibernation are particularly dangerous due to a combination of factors that wildlife biologists have studied extensively. After months of dormancy, their normal behavioral patterns are disrupted, making them more unpredictable and aggressive than during other seasons. Mothers with cubs are exponentially more dangerous, as they will attack any perceived threat without warning or provocation. The bear's metabolism was also slowly returning to normal activity levels, meaning she had not yet regained the full coordination and decision-making capacity of her active season behavior. At 10:31 a.m., the critical moment arrived with devastating suddenness. Tyler was navigating a sharp right turn around a cluster of large boulders when his track broke through the snow crust directly above the den entrance. The snowmobile dropped 3 feet into the hidden cavity, its engine racing as the track lost contact with solid ground. Tyler instinctively hit the throttle harder, trying to power out of what he assumed was simply a hidden depression in the trail. The sound of the spinning track, combined with chunks of snow and ice falling into her den and onto her cubs, triggered an explosive response from the mother grizzly. She erupted from the den entrance with a roar that could be heard for miles, her massive form appearing as if materialized from the earth itself. At 380 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, she was a force of nature incarnate, every muscle developed by evolution for survival in one of North America's harshest environments. Tyler's first glimpse of the bear came as his machine was still stuck, engine screaming and track throwing snow in all directions. The grizzly appeared to his left, less than 10 feet away, her winter coat thick and silver-tipped, her massive head lowered in the classic aggressive posture. For a split second that seemed to last an eternity, predator and prey stared at each other across a gap measured in heartbeats rather than distance. The bear's charge covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. Despite weighing nearly 400 pounds, she moved with the fluid grace of a creature designed by millions of years of evolution for exactly this type of explosive attack. Her powerful hindquarters propelled her forward, while her front paws, equipped with claws over 3 inches long, reached for her target with terrifying precision. Tyler's training and reflexes, honed by years of extreme sports and quick reaction situations, prompted him to throw himself sideways off his stuck snowmobile. His movement saved his life for perhaps 5 seconds, as the bear's initial charge carried her into the machine itself rather than into his body. The impact of 380 pounds traveling at 30 miles per hour struck the snowmobile with the force of a small truck, sending it flying sideways and finally freeing it from the hole it had created. Jason, following 20 yards behind, had time to register the impossible scene unfolding before him, but not enough time to react effectively. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. His best friend diving away from his snowmobile, while a massive grizzly bear destroyed the machine with blows that sounded like thunder. Jason's training told him to retreat, to back his machine away and call for help, but his loyalty to Tyler overrode self-preservation. The grizzly, having eliminated what she perceived as the primary threat, turned her attention to Tyler, who was struggling to his feet in snow that was 3 feet deep and had the consistency of quicksand. His heavy winter riding gear, designed to protect him from cold and impacts, now worked against him by restricting his mobility and adding weight that made movement through deep snow nearly impossible. The bear located him instantly, her predator's instincts honed by millions of generations of hunting and territorial defense. Tyler's second and final glimpse of the bear came as she reared up on her hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall and displaying the full, awesome power of her species. Her roar was a sound unlike anything in nature, a combination of rage, territoriality, and maternal protection that struck fear into every living creature within miles. Smaller animals, martens, snowshoe hares, and birds fled the area instantly, recognizing the sound of death itself. The bear's attack was swift and decisive. Her front paws, each capable of delivering over 1,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, struck Tyler in the chest and head with surgical precision. The claws, designed to dig roots and tear apart logs in search of grubs, penetrated his protective riding gear as if it were made of paper. The impact lifted him completely off his feet and threw him 15 feet through the air, his body describing a terrifying arc against the blue winter sky, before disappearing into a drift of soft powder snow. Jason watched in horror as his best friend vanished beneath the snow, and then the bear turned toward him with the fluid grace of a predator selecting its next target. Everything in Jason's mind screamed at him to flee, to gun his machine and escape while the bear was focused elsewhere. But the thought of abandoning Tyler was impossible to contemplate. Instead, he made a decision that would haunt the surviving witnesses and family members for years to come. He drove directly toward the bear, hoping to distract it long enough for Tyler to escape. Jason's Ski-Doo MXZ responded instantly to his desperate acceleration, the 850cc engine providing maximum power as he aimed directly at the grizzly. His plan, formed in the microseconds available for decision-making, was to force the bear to dodge and hopefully create enough confusion for both of them to escape. The machine's speedometer showed 45 miles per hour as he approached the bear, snow flying from his track in a rooster tail that glittered in the morning sun. The collision between Jason's snowmobile and the grizzly bear was a meeting of modern technology and primal power that ended with the inevitable victory of nature over machine. The bear, rather than dodging as Jason had hoped, met the challenge head-on, rising on her hind legs and catching the machine's windshield and handlebars in her massive front paws. The impact knocked her backward, but her claws found purchase in the plastic and metal, and she used her powerful hindquarters to push back against the machine's momentum. Jason felt his world explode into chaos as his snowmobile suddenly decelerated from 45 miles per hour to 0 in the space of 3 feet. The laws of physics demanded that his body continue forward at its original velocity, and he was catapulted over the handlebars and directly into the waiting embrace of 380 pounds of enraged grizzly bear. His helmet struck the bear's massive skull with a crack that echoed across the mountainside, the polycarbonate plastic shattering on impact. The bear's response was instantaneous and terrifying in its efficiency. Her powerful jaws, capable of crushing the leg bones of an adult elk, closed on Jason's torso with hydraulic precision. Her canine teeth, over 2 inches long and designed to puncture the thick hide of large prey animals, penetrated his riding suit and into his ribcage. The distinctive sound of ribs breaking was audible even over the continued rumbling of both snowmobile engines, which continued running despite the absence of their operators. What followed was a scene of primal violence that lasted approximately 90 seconds, but would replay in the nightmares of investigators and rescue personnel for years afterward. The bear, following instincts programmed by millions of years of evolution, proceeded to neutralize both threats to her cubs, using the methods that had ensured her species' survival since the Pleistocene. Her powerful jaws and claws worked with methodical precision, while her cubs, still hidden in the den beneath the snow, continued their frightened crying. Tyler, partially buried in the snowdrift where the bear's initial attack had thrown him, regained consciousness for perhaps 30 seconds during the attack. His vision, compromised by blood and snow, registered the sounds of the continued violence and the impossible sight of his snowmobile track still spinning where his machine had landed, thrown aside like a toy by the bear's initial charge. His final conscious thought was of his parents, who would be expecting him home for Sunday dinner in 2 days. Jason's death came more quickly, though witnesses would never be available to confirm the exact sequence of events. The bear's attack was thorough and professional, employing the same techniques she would use on any large prey animal that threatened her offspring. Her powerful hindquarters allowed her to pin his body, while her front paws and jaws completed the work with devastating efficiency. By 10:45 a.m., the attack was over. The mountain returned to its previous silence, broken only by the continued rumbling of two snowmobile engines that had been designed to keep running under the most extreme conditions. The bear, satisfied that the threats to her cubs had been eliminated, returned to her den to comfort her frightened offspring. Snow began to drift over the scene, nature beginning the process of concealing the evidence of what had occurred. The first snowmobile was Tyler's Arctic Cat Thundercat, which had landed upright after being thrown aside by the bear's charge, but was now running roughly due to snow packed into its air intake system. The machine's sophisticated electronic fuel injection system continued trying to compensate for the restricted airflow, causing the engine to run rich and produce the black smoke that would eventually attract the attention of rescue aircraft. The second machine, Jason's Ski-Doo, had landed on its side but continued running, its safety systems having failed to trigger due to the unusual nature of the impact. The GPS units in both machines continued recording their locations, transmitting coordinates to satellites 12,000 miles overhead that would eventually play a crucial role in the recovery operation. Tyler's unit showed a location of 47.9891 degrees north, 114.2654 degrees west, while Jason's registered 47.9893 degrees north, 114.2651 degrees west, a separation of less than 50 yards that would later help investigators understand the rapid sequence of events that had led to both deaths. The temperature at the attack site was -12 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the scene would be preserved in pristine condition until discovery. The high-pressure weather system continued to dominate the region, ensuring clear skies and light winds that would aid in the eventual search and rescue operation. Snow depth at the attack site measured 72 inches, having accumulated throughout the winter in this sheltered location where wind could not scour it away. At 11:30 a.m., approximately 45 minutes after the attack, a commercial airline flight from Seattle to Minneapolis passed overhead at 37,000 feet. Captain Robert Stevens, a 30-year veteran of Northwest Airlines, was conducting a routine position check when his co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Walsh, noticed an unusual sight far below. Through breaks in the scattered cloud cover, she observed two small trails of smoke rising from what appeared to be a pristine wilderness area. "Captain, look at those smoke trails at our 2 o'clock position," Officer Walsh reported, pointing toward the barely visible columns rising from the snow-covered landscape below. "That doesn't look like any normal forest activity." Captain Stevens adjusted his course slightly to get a better view and confirmed the observation. The smoke was too localized and too persistent to be a natural phenomenon, and the location was far from any known settlements or industrial activity. Following standard aviation protocols, he contacted air traffic control in Great Falls to report the sighting, providing precise coordinates derived from the aircraft's GPS navigation system. At 11:47 a.m., the report reached the Flathead County Sheriff's Office through the Federal Aviation Administration's communication network. Dispatcher Sarah Martinez, a 10-year veteran who had handled hundreds of wilderness emergency reports, initially classified the incident as a possible aircraft crash, based on the remote location and presence of smoke. She immediately initiated emergency protocols, contacting the Civil Air Patrol, Mountain Rescue Service, and local Forest Service personnel. Sheriff William Thompson, elected to his position 6 years earlier, following a career as a detective with the Montana Highway Patrol, was conducting routine paperwork at his office in Kalispell when the call came in. His experience with wilderness emergencies was extensive, having coordinated dozens of search and rescue operations in the challenging terrain surrounding Flathead Lake. The coordinates provided by the airline crew placed the incident deep in the Flathead National Forest, accessible only by helicopter or several hours of difficult overland travel, At 12:15 p.m., the first rescue helicopter lifted off from Kalispell Regional Airport, piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Michael Davies of the Montana Army National Guard. Davies, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan where he had flown medical evacuation missions in mountainous terrain, was accompanied by Flathead County Search and Rescue Coordinator Janet Williams and paramedic Thomas Chen. The aircraft, a UH-60 Black Hawk modified for high-altitude rescue operations, was equipped with advanced GPS navigation, thermal imaging equipment, and medical supplies sufficient for multiple casualties. The flight to the reported coordinates took 28 minutes, following the eastern shore of Flathead Lake before turning into the mountainous terrain where the smoke had been observed. Davies maintained an altitude of 8,000 feet initially, well above the highest peaks in the area, while Williams used binoculars to scan for signs of the reported smoke. The weather conditions remained excellent, with unlimited visibility and winds under 10 knots. At 12:43 p.m., they located the source of the smoke plumes that had been reported by the airline crew. From an altitude of 500 feet above the treetops, the scene was clearly visible, but initially difficult to interpret. 2 snowmobiles were visible in a small clearing, one upright but producing dark smoke, the other lying on its side. Tracks in the snow showed the approach routes of both machines, but the actual location of any victims was not immediately apparent. Williams, who had coordinated over 200 wilderness rescues during her 15-year career, immediately recognized the scene as a snowmobile accident, but noted several unusual features. The machines were separated by a distance that suggested high-speed impacts, and the disturbed snow covered a much larger area than would be expected from a simple collision or mechanical failure. Most concerning was the complete absence of any human figures moving around the accident site. "I need to get closer," Davies announced through the aircraft's intercom system. "Something doesn't look right about this scene." The helicopter descended to an altitude of 200 feet, low enough for the rescue team to clearly observe details on the ground while maintaining sufficient altitude for safety. At this height, the rotor wash began affecting the snow surface, creating whirlwinds of powder that obscured their view intermittently, but also revealed features that had been hidden beneath the surface. It was paramedic Thomas Chen who first spotted what would later be identified as Tyler's body, partially buried in a drift of snow approximately 30 feet from his overturned snowmobile. The distinctive bright blue color of his riding suit was barely visible through the snow that had accumulated over him during the hour since the attack. Chen immediately pointed out the location to his teammates and began preparing for a rapid deployment to assess the victim's condition. At 12:51 p.m., Davies maneuvered the helicopter to a landing zone approximately 100 yards from the accident site, the maximum distance that would allow the rescue team to operate safely while keeping the aircraft positioned for immediate evacuation if necessary. The landing was complicated by the deep snow and uneven terrain, but Davies' extensive experience in similar conditions allowed him to settle the aircraft safely with minimal rotor wash disturbance to the accident scene. Williams and Chen immediately deployed with full rescue equipment, including medical supplies, avalanche probes, and communication gear that would maintain contact with both the helicopter and county dispatch. The temperature at ground level measured -10 degrees, and the snow depth required them to use snowshoes to avoid post-holing through the surface crust. Their approach to the accident site was methodical, following protocols designed to preserve evidence while prioritizing the medical needs of any survivors. Chen reached Tyler's location first and immediately began the process of uncovering and assessing his condition. Even before fully exposing the body, it was apparent that the victim had sustained massive trauma inconsistent with any snowmobile accident Chen had encountered in 12 years as a wilderness paramedic. The extent and nature of the injuries suggested an animal attack. though the specific species responsible was not immediately apparent. Williams, meanwhile, had located Jason's body near his overturned snowmobile. The scene around this location showed extensive signs of disturbance, with snow trampled and scattered over an area roughly 20 feet in diameter. Blood was visible in several locations, though the sub-freezing temperatures had caused it to freeze immediately upon contact with the snow. Like Tyler, Jason had sustained injuries that were clearly not consistent with mechanical trauma from a snowmobile accident. At 1:07 p.m., Williams radioed her initial assessment to Sheriff Thompson, who was coordinating the operation from the County Emergency Operations Center. Her report was concise but chilling. "We have 2 fatalities, both male, early 20s, with injuries consistent with a large predator attack. The scene shows extensive animal activity. Recommend immediate response from Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the coroner's office." Sheriff Thompson immediately expanded the emergency response to include Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Bear Specialist Dr. Rebecca Martinez, who was located at her office in Kalispell and could be on scene within 2 hours. Dr. Martinez had investigated over 50 bear-human encounters during her career and was the state's leading expert on grizzly bear behavior and attack patterns. Her presence would be essential for determining the species responsible and assessing the ongoing danger to rescue personnel. The coroner's office presented a more complex logistical challenge, as the bodies would need to be transported from the remote accident site to the county morgue for official examination. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the Flathead County coroner, had been elected to her position 8 years earlier, following a career as a forensic pathologist. Her experience with wilderness fatalities was extensive, though animal attacks remained relatively rare, even in Montana's bear country. At 1:23 p.m., Chen completed his examination of both victims and confirmed Williams's initial assessment. Both young men had sustained fatal injuries from what appeared to be a bear attack, with Tyler showing evidence of massive blunt force trauma and Jason displaying puncture wounds consistent with large predator dentition. The attack had been swift and decisive, with neither victim showing signs of defensive wounds that would indicate a prolonged struggle. The discovery of personal identification in Tyler's wallet allowed the rescue team to begin the process of victim identification and family notification. Tyler James Grant, age 22, was listed as a student at Montana State University with a local address in Bozeman. His emergency contact information included his parents, James and Susan Grant of Billings, who would soon receive the most devastating phone call of their lives. Jason's identification was recovered from his snowmobile storage compartment, where he had secured his wallet in a waterproof container along with their maps and emergency supplies. Jason David Miller, also age 22, shared the same Bozeman address as Tyler, confirming that they were friends and likely roommates. His emergency contacts listed his parents, Robert and Linda Miller, along with a sister, Jennifer Miller Rodriguez, who lived in Missoula. While the rescue team worked to secure the scene and prepare the bodies for transport, the abandoned snowmobiles continued their mechanical death songs. Tyler's Arctic Cat had finally succumbed to the snow packed in its air intake, the engine seizing with a final mechanical groan that echoed across the mountainside. Jason's Ski-Doo continued running, its fuel tank still containing enough gasoline for several more hours of operation. At 1:45 p.m., Dr. Martinez arrived on scene via a second helicopter, accompanied by Fish, Wildlife and Parks enforcement officers Bradley Morrison and Lisa Chang. Morrison, a 20-year veteran of wildlife law enforcement, had investigated dozens of bear encounters and immediately began documenting the scene with photographs and measurements that would be essential for determining the exact sequence of events. Dr. Martinez's initial examination of the attack site confirmed what the rescue team had already suspected. The perpetrator was an adult grizzly bear, probably a female based on track measurements and behavioral patterns evident in the disturbed snow. The bear had approached from the east, where dense forest provided concealment, and had attacked both victims in rapid succession before retreating to the same location. This was a defensive attack, Dr. Martinez explained to Sheriff Thompson via radio. The bear didn't pursue the victims or attempt to feed on them. She eliminated what she perceived as threats and then withdrew. That behavior pattern is consistent with a sow protecting cubs. The implications of this assessment were immediately apparent to everyone involved in the rescue operation. A mother grizzly with cubs represented the most dangerous possible encounter with any North American wildlife species. The cubs would be hidden somewhere near the attack site, probably in a winter den that had been accidentally disturbed by the snowmobiles. The mother would remain in the immediate area and would attack anyone who approached her offspring. Officer Chang used GPS equipment to mark the exact location of both bodies, along with the positions of the abandoned snowmobiles and significant blood evidence. Her measurements would later be used to create a detailed diagram of the attack site for both the criminal investigation and the scientific analysis that would be conducted by bear behavior specialists from across North America. At 2:12 p.m., the first signs of the bear's continued presence became apparent when Dr. Martinez discovered fresh tracks leading away from the attack site toward a large pile of deadfall timber approximately 50 yards to the northeast. The tracks were clear and recent, pressed into snow that had fallen after the attack, indicating that the bear had returned to check on the area within the past hour. "We need to establish a security perimeter immediately, Doctor." Martinez radioed to the helicopter crews. "The bear is still in the immediate area, and she will defend this territory aggressively if she perceives any threats to her cubs." Sheriff Thompson made the decision to evacuate the rescue team temporarily while bear specialists determined the safest approach for body recovery. The two helicopters lifted off at 2:18 p.m., carrying all personnel to a staging area at the Lost Horse Trail parking area where additional resources were gathering. The bodies would remain at the attack site, protected by the sub-freezing temperatures until a safe recovery plan could be implemented. The parking area had been transformed into a command center, with emergency vehicles from multiple agencies converging on the remote location. The Flathead County Sheriff's Office had established communications equipment and coordination facilities, while the Montana Highway Patrol provided security and traffic control. Forest Service personnel were en route with detailed maps and local knowledge that would be essential for planning the recovery operation. At 2:45 p.m., the most difficult aspect of the entire operation began: notification of the victims' families. Sheriff Thompson personally handled the initial phone calls, a responsibility he had performed dozens of times during his career, but which never became easier. The conversations were brief and devastating, providing only the essential facts while promising more detailed information as it became available. James Grant, Tyler's father, was at his office at Grant Construction in Billings when the call came. A successful contractor who had built his business over 25 years, James had been looking forward to his son's graduation from college and eventual entry into the family business. The phone call shattered those dreams in 30 seconds of official language that couldn't soften the reality of what had occurred. "Mr. Grant, this is Sheriff Thompson from Flathead County. I'm calling with information about your son, Tyler. There has been an accident in the wilderness area near Flathead Lake, and I regret to inform you that Tyler was killed this morning." The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds, as James Grant's mind struggled to process information that seemed impossible to comprehend. His son had called the previous evening, excited about their snowmobiling adventure and promising to check in when they returned to Bozeman on Sunday evening. The transition from anticipation to devastation occurred in the span of a single phone call. Susan Grant, Tyler's mother, was teaching her third-grade class at Billings Elementary School when the principal, Margaret Foster appeared at her classroom door with an expression that immediately communicated tragedy. As a teacher with 18 years of experience, Susan had delivered difficult news to countless parents, but she was unprepared for the role reversal that was about to occur. The phone call to the Miller family followed a similar pattern, with Robert Miller receiving the news at his home, where he was working in his woodshop, building cabinets for the kitchen renovation he and Linda had been planning for months. As a retired forest ranger, Robert understood wilderness dangers better than most people, but he had assumed his son's careful planning and extensive experience would protect him from serious harm. Linda Miller was at her job as a nurse at Community Medical Center in Missoula when the call was transferred to her station. Her medical training had prepared her to deal with trauma and death as professional necessities, but no training could prepare her for the words that would end her son's life in a few brief sentences delivered over a scratchy phone connection. By 3:30 p.m., both families had begun the agonizing process of traveling to Kalispell, where they would await the recovery of their sons' bodies and begin learning the details of what had occurred. The drive from Billings would take the Grant family over 4 hours, while the Millers faced a shorter but equally devastating journey from Missoula. Neither family was prepared for the media attention that was already beginning to focus on the story. The first news report appeared on KPAX-TV in Missoula at 4 p.m., based on monitored radio communications between emergency services agencies. The initial report was brief and factual, confirming only that 2 snowmobilers had been killed in a wilderness area east of Flathead Lake, and that the incident was under investigation. However, the mention of bear specialists being called to the scene was sufficient to attract regional and then national media attention. By 5 p.m., news trucks from television stations in Missoula, Great Falls, and Spokane were en route to the Lost Horse Trail staging area, while reporters from newspapers throughout the Northwest were making phone calls to law enforcement agencies and wildlife officials. The story had all the elements that attracted media coverage: young victims, exotic predators, and a remote wilderness setting that captured the public imagination. Dr. Martinez spent the afternoon developing a strategy for safely recovering the bodies while managing the risk posed by the mother grizzly and her cubs. Her plan involved using noisemakers and vehicles to temporarily drive the bear away from the area while a recovery team quickly retrieved the victims. The operation would be dangerous and would require precise timing and coordination among multiple agencies. "We're dealing with a bear that has already demonstrated aggressive behavior," she explained to Sheriff Thompson during a planning session at 5:30 p.m. "She will interpret any approach to the attack site as a threat to her cubs. We need to be prepared for another attack if our deterrent methods are unsuccessful." The recovery operation was scheduled for first light on January 17th, using the early morning hours when bear activity was typically at its lowest level. 2 helicopters would approach the site simultaneously, one carrying the recovery team and the other equipped with noisemakers and rubber bullets that could be used to deter the bear if necessary. The operation would be conducted with military precision, minimizing the time personnel spent on the ground in the danger zone. As darkness fell on January 16th, the attack site remained under the protection of the mother grizzly, who had established a defensive perimeter around her den and cubs. The abandoned snowmobiles had finally fallen silent as fuel tanks emptied and engines seized, leaving the mountainside in the profound quiet that characterizes winter nights in the northern Rockies. Snow began falling lightly, beginning the process of covering the evidence of the day's tragedy. The families of both victims spent the night in Kalispell hotels, waiting for dawn and the recovery operation that would allow them to begin the grieving process. James and Susan Grant sat in their room at the Hampton Inn, staring at photographs of Tyler on Susan's phone and trying to comprehend how their vibrant, adventurous son could be reduced to official reports and recovery operations. Their conversation was sparse and repetitive, circling around the same impossible questions without finding answers. Robert and Linda Miller, accompanied by their daughter Jennifer, occupied a suite at the Hilton Garden Inn, where they met with Sheriff Thompson and Dr. Martinez for a detailed briefing on what had occurred and what would happen during the recovery operation. As a former forest ranger, Robert asked technical questions about bear behavior and attack patterns, seeking some rational explanation for the senseless tragedy that had claimed his son's life. "This was not a predatory attack," Dr. Martinez explained patiently. "The bear was protecting her cubs from what she perceived as a life-threatening situation. Your son and his friend accidentally stumbled into the worst possible scenario in bear country. There was nothing they could have done differently once the encounter began." The recovery operation began at 6:45 a.m. on January 17th, with Dr. Martinez and Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers, conducting aerial reconnaissance to locate the mother bear and assess her current behavior. The grizzly was visible near the deadfall where her den was located, approximately 75 yards from the attack site. Her alertness and defensive posturing indicated that she remained highly protective of her cubs and would respond aggressively to any approach. At 7:15 a.m., the noise deterrent helicopter made its first pass over the attack site, using air horns and engine noise to encourage the bear to retreat to a greater distance. The bear's response was immediate and alarming. Rather than retreating, she charged toward the sound, demonstrating the aggressive behavior that made recovery operations so dangerous. Only when the helicopter climbed to an altitude of 500 feet did the bear halt her charge and return to her defensive position. Sheriff Thompson made the decision to proceed with the recovery despite the bear's aggressive response, calculating that the risk to personnel could be managed through careful timing and coordination. The recovery team, including coroner's investigator Dr. Patricia Hendricks, descended to the attack site via helicopter, while the deterrent aircraft maintained a position that kept the bear focused away from the recovery area. The actual recovery of both bodies required only 12 minutes, though those 12 minutes represented some of the most dangerous wildlife-human interaction ever documented in Montana. The mother grizzly made 2 charges toward the recovery site, each time being turned back by noise from the deterrent helicopter, but her persistence demonstrated the extreme protective behavior that had made the initial attack inevitable. Tyler's body was recovered first, extracted from the snowdrift where the bear's initial attack had thrown him. Dr. Hendricks' preliminary examination confirmed massive blunt force trauma consistent with being struck by an adult grizzly bear. The force of the impact had been sufficient to throw his 180-pound body 15 feet through the air, and the injuries were immediately fatal. Jason's body was recovered from its position near his overturned snowmobile, where the extended attack had occurred. The scene showed extensive signs of the bear's aggressive behavior, with snow trampled and blood evidence scattered over a wide area. Dr. Hendricks noted puncture wounds consistent with grizzly bear dentition, along with evidence of the crushing force that characterized attacks by large predators. Both bodies were transported to the Flathead County Morgue in Kalispell, where formal autopsies would be conducted to document the exact cause and manner of death. The snowmobiles were also recovered for examination by accident reconstruction specialists, though their role in the incident was clearly secondary to the wildlife encounter that had caused the fatalities. The families were notified of the successful recovery at 8:30 a.m., allowing them to begin making funeral arrangements while the investigation continued. Both families requested that the bear and her cubs not be destroyed, understanding that the attack had been a natural response to perceived threats rather than aberrant aggressive behavior. Their requests would carry significant weight in determining the official response to the incident. By 9 a.m. on January 17th, the story had achieved national prominence, with coverage appearing on CNN, Fox News, and major network morning shows. The combination of young victims, a dramatic wilderness setting, and the involvement of protected grizzly bears created a story that captured public attention far beyond the regional interest typical of wildlife encounters. The media coverage brought immediate pressure on wildlife management agencies to explain how such an attack could occur and what measures were being taken to prevent similar incidents. Dr. Martinez found herself conducting press conferences and interviews while simultaneously managing the ongoing investigation and assessment of the bear family that had been involved. The bear den site was placed under 24-hour surveillance by Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel who documented the mother's continued protective behavior and the presence of at least 2 cubs that occasionally appeared at the den entrance. The decision regarding the bear's fate would be made by a panel of wildlife experts, taking into account the circumstances of the attack and the conservation status of grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies. Autopsies conducted on January 18th confirmed the preliminary assessments made at the attack site. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the forensic pathologist who conducted both examinations, documented injuries consistent with grizzly bear attack patterns studied by wildlife researchers throughout North America. Tyler had died instantly from massive blunt force trauma, while Jason had succumbed to puncture wounds and crushing injuries inflicted by the bear's powerful jaws. The toxicology reports, completed 3 days later, showed no evidence of alcohol or drug impairment in either victim. Blood analysis confirmed that both young men had been alert and sober at the time of the attack, eliminating any suggestion that impaired judgment had contributed to the tragedy. The findings supported witness statements and evidence that the encounter had been a random and unavoidable wildlife interaction. Investigation of the snowmobiles revealed no mechanical defects that might have contributed to the accident. Tyler's Arctic Cat had been functioning normally until it broke through the snow crust above the bear den, and Jason's Ski-Doo showed no signs of mechanical problems that might have prevented him from escaping the area. The evidence confirmed that both machines had been operated safely and responsibly up until the moment of the encounter. GPS data recovered from both snowmobiles provided a precise timeline of events leading up to the attack. The machines had followed their planned route exactly, maintaining safe speeds and appropriate spacing. The location where Tyler's snowmobile broke through the snow crust was clearly marked in the GPS data, occurring at 10:31:17 a.m. according to the precision timing systems in both machines. The Forest Service initiated a comprehensive review of trail marking and public information regarding bear safety in the Lost Horse Creek area. The trail where the attack occurred had been properly maintained and marked according to established standards, and current bear activity information had been posted at trailheads as required. However, the presence of an active bear den so close to established trails raised questions about seasonal closures and area monitoring. Wildlife biologists from the University of Montana began a detailed study of the attack site and bear behavior, seeking to understand the factors that had led to such an aggressive defensive response. Dr. Charles Williamson, who had studied grizzly bear behavior for over 20 years, noted that the combination of a den site near a human travel corridor and the unusual January emergence from hibernation created an almost impossible scenario to predict or prevent. The attack site remained closed to public access indefinitely, with Fish, Wildlife and Parks maintaining a safety perimeter until the bear family could be safely relocated or the cubs had matured enough to survive independently. The closure encompassed over 1,000 acres of wilderness, effectively eliminating recreational access to a popular winter recreation area for the remainder of the season. Funeral services for both victims were conducted on January 22nd, with Tyler's service held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Billings and Jason's at Christ the King Catholic Church in Missoula. Both services drew hundreds of mourners, including classmates from Montana State University, family friends, and members of the outdoor recreation community who had been affected by the tragedy. The services were covered by regional media, keeping the story in public attention. Tyler's funeral was attended by over 400 people, reflecting the wide circle of friends and family who had been touched by his enthusiastic approach to life and his infectious optimism about the future. His engineering professors spoke about his potential as a designer and problem solver, while his roommates and friends shared memories of camping trips, skiing adventures, and late-night study sessions that had characterized his college years. The eulogy was delivered by his father, James Grant, who struggled through an emotional tribute to his son's passion for outdoor adventure and mechanical innovation. "Tyler lived every day as if it were his last adventure," James said. "He would not want his death to discourage others from experiencing the wilderness he loved so much. He would want us to learn from what happened and find ways to make the outdoors safer for everyone." Jason's funeral drew a similar crowd of mourners who remembered his careful planning, leadership qualities, and loyalty to his friends. His father, Robert Miller, used his Forest Service experience to contextualize the tragedy within the broader relationship between humans and wildlife in the Northern Rockies. "Jason understood and respected the wilderness and its inhabitants," Robert said. "What happened was a tragedy, but it was not a failure of that understanding or respect." The University of Montana established memorial scholarships in honor of both students, funded by donations from the outdoor recreation industry and private contributors who had been moved by the story. The scholarships would support students pursuing degrees in wildlife management, outdoor recreation, or mechanical engineering, reflecting the interests and career plans that had defined both young men. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks announced on February 1st that the mother grizzly and her cubs would not be destroyed, accepting the recommendation of a panel of bear experts who determined that the attack had been a natural defensive response rather than aberrant, aggressive behavior. The bear family would be monitored through the remainder of winter and relocated to a more remote area if necessary when the cubs were old enough to travel. The decision was supported by both families, who issued a joint statement expressing their belief that destroying the bears would not honor their son's memory or contribute to wilderness safety. Tyler and Jason understood that sharing the wilderness with dangerous wildlife was part of what made their adventures meaningful, the statement read. They would not want their deaths to result in the destruction of a mother protecting her cubs. Environmental groups and wildlife conservation organizations praised the decision as evidence of evolving attitudes toward human-wildlife conflict. The National Wildlife Federation noted that the case demonstrated the possibility of tragic outcomes that didn't require retaliatory killing of wildlife, particularly in cases involving protected species like grizzly bears. However, the decision also drew criticism from some outdoor recreation groups and local residents who argued that aggressive bears should be removed from areas with high human use. The Montana Snowmobile Association called for increased bear monitoring and early warning systems that might prevent similar encounters, while acknowledging that some wildlife risks were inherent to backcountry recreation. The winter recreation industry began incorporating the attack into safety education programs, using the incident as a case study in wilderness risk assessment and emergency preparedness. Snowmobile manufacturers added bear safety information to their owners' manuals, while guide services and rental operations expanded their safety briefings to include wildlife encounter protocols. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate families, affecting the broader community of outdoor recreation enthusiasts throughout the region. Many experienced backcountry travelers found themselves questioning activities they had enjoyed for years, while others became more aggressive advocates for wilderness access rights and wildlife management policies. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist specializing in trauma related to outdoor recreation accidents, noted that the attack had created a form of collective trauma within the snowmobile community. When something like this happens to experienced, careful riders, it challenges everyone's sense of security in activities they've considered safe, she explained. The randomness of the encounter makes it particularly difficult to process and recover from. Support groups formed spontaneously among friends and classmates of the victims, providing forums for processing grief and anxiety related to the attack. Montana State University's Counseling Center reported a significant increase in requests for assistance from students dealing with concerns about outdoor recreation safety and the loss of their classmates. The academic community responded to the incident by initiating new research into human-wildlife conflict in recreational settings. The University of Montana's Wildlife Biology program launched a multi-year study of bear behavior near winter recreation areas, while Montana State University's engineering department began developing early warning systems that might detect bear activity near popular trails. Law enforcement agencies throughout the region reviewed their protocols for wilderness rescue operations involving potentially dangerous wildlife. The Flathead County incident became a training scenario for search and rescue teams, highlighting the complex decision-making required when human safety conflicts with wildlife protection concerns. The incident also prompted legislative discussions about liability and responsibility in wilderness recreation. Some lawmakers proposed requiring GPS tracking devices for all backcountry travelers, while others suggested expanded funding for wildlife monitoring and area closure programs. However, most outdoor recreation advocates opposed increased regulation, arguing that wilderness experiences required accepting certain unavoidable risks. 6 months after the attack, the mother grizzly and her cubs were successfully relocated to a remote area of Glacier National Park, over 50 miles from the nearest recreational trail. The relocation was conducted using techniques that minimize stress on the bear family while ensuring their permanent separation from areas with high human use potential. All 3 bears were fitted with radio collars that would allow monitoring of their movements and behavior for at least 2 years. The attack site remained closed to public access throughout 2025, allowing natural processes to restore the area while researchers documented environmental factors that might have contributed to the encounter. Plans called for eventual reopening with improved signage and possible seasonal restrictions during periods when bear activity might be elevated. The families of both victims established a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety education and wildlife conservation, using insurance settlements and donations to fund research and educational programs. The Tyler Grant and Jason Miller Memorial Foundation sponsored bear safety workshops, funded research into human-wildlife conflict, and provided scholarships for students pursuing careers in wildlife management or outdoor recreation safety. 1 year after the attack, on January 16, 2026, memorial services were held at the Lost Horse Trail staging area, attended by family members, friends, and representatives from wildlife management agencies. The ceremony included the dedication of a memorial plaque honoring both victims and acknowledging the complex relationship between human recreation and wildlife conservation in the Northern Rockies. The plaque's inscription read, "In memory of Tyler James Grant and Jason David Miller, who died January 16, 2025, while pursuing their passion for wilderness adventure. Their deaths remind us that sharing wild places with wild animals requires respect, preparation, and acceptance of risks that cannot be eliminated. May their memory inspire continued efforts to balance human recreation with wildlife conservation. The incident continued to influence wildlife management policies and outdoor recreation practices throughout the Northwest, serving as a case study in the unavoidable conflicts that arise when human activities intersect with wildlife habitat. The attack demonstrated both the limits of safety precautions in wilderness settings and the importance of maintaining wild places where natural predator behaviors could continue to exist. 5 years later, in 2030, researchers published a comprehensive analysis of the attack in the Journal of Wildlife Management, documenting every aspect of the encounter and its aftermath. The study became required reading for wildlife managers, outdoor recreation professionals, and search and rescue personnel throughout North America. The detailed timeline and behavioral analysis provided insights that influenced protocols for managing human-wildlife conflicts in recreational settings. The mother grizzly, still monitored by radio collar, had successfully raised her cubs to independence and produced a second litter in 2027. Behavior remained completely normal, with no signs of increased aggression toward humans or abnormal territorial behavior. The successful outcome validated the decision not to destroy her following the attack, demonstrating that defensive attacks did not necessarily indicate problematic behavior requiring management intervention. Tyler's parents, James and Susan Grant, eventually found some measure of peace through their involvement with the Memorial Foundation and their support for wildlife conservation efforts. They became advocates for improved wilderness safety education while maintaining that outdoor recreation should continue despite inherent risks. Tyler would be proud that his death contributed to better understanding between humans and wildlife, Susan Grant said in a 2030 interview. He always believed that we were visitors in their world. Jason's family followed a similar path, with Robert Miller using his Forest Service background to become an expert witness in wildlife management decisions, and Linda Miller developing a career as a grief counselor specializing in outdoor recreation tragedies. Their daughter, Jennifer, established a scholarship program for women pursuing careers in wildlife biology, inspired by the female scientists who had investigated her brother's death. The snowmobiles involved in the attack were eventually donated to the University of Montana's Mechanical Engineering program, where they were used to study the interaction between recreational vehicles and winter wildlife habitat. Engineering students developed prototype warning systems that might detect large animal presence near trails, though the technology remained experimental and had not been deployed in operational settings. The broader impact of the attack on grizzly bear conservation was largely positive, with the incident highlighting the species' continued presence in habitats where they had been absent for decades. Wildlife advocates used the case to support expanded protection measures and habitat conservation programs, arguing that such encounters demonstrated the success of recovery efforts that had brought grizzly bears back to areas of their historic range. However, the attack also provided ammunition for opponents of predator conservation programs, who argued that expanding bear populations created unacceptable risks for outdoor recreation enthusiasts. The political debate continued for years, with the January 16, 2025 attack frequently cited by both sides as evidence supporting their positions. 10 years after the attack, in 2035, the Lost Horse Trail area was quietly reopened to winter recreation, with improved signage and seasonal restrictions during denning periods. The reopening was controversial, with some arguing that the area should remain permanently closed as a memorial to the victims, while others maintained that excluding recreational access dishonored the victims' love of wilderness adventure. The memorial plaque installed at the staging area became a pilgrimage site for outdoor recreation enthusiasts, particularly snowmobilers who wanted to pay their respects to Tyler and Jason while reflecting on the risks inherent to backcountry travel. Many visitors left flowers, energy bars, or small tokens that represented their own wilderness experiences and close calls with dangerous wildlife. By 2040, 15 years after the attack, the incident had become part of the folklore of northwestern wilderness recreation, passed down through informal networks of guides, outfitters, and experienced backcountry travelers. New generations of outdoor enthusiasts learned about Tyler Grant and Jason Miller as cautionary examples of how quickly wilderness adventures could turn deadly, regardless of experience, preparation, or caution. The mother grizzly died of natural causes in 2041, at the estimated age of 24 years, having successfully raised multiple litters of cubs and contributed significantly to the genetic diversity of the northern Rocky Mountain grizzly bear population. Her death was noted by researchers who had followed her career since the 2025 attack, marking the end of an era in human-wildlife conflict studies. The scientific legacy of the January 16, 2025 attack continued to influence wildlife management and outdoor recreation safety protocols well into the 2040s. The detailed documentation of every aspect of the incident, from the initial approach to the final family memorial services, provided a comprehensive case study that informed policy decisions affecting millions of acres of public land and thousands of recreational users annually. The foundation established by both families had grown into a major funding source for wilderness safety research and wildlife conservation, distributing over $2 million annually to projects throughout North America. The Foundation's work expanded beyond bear safety to encompass broader issues of human-wildlife coexistence, climate change impacts on wildlife behavior, and the development of new technologies for detecting and avoiding dangerous wildlife encounters. Educational programs developed using the attack as a case study reached hundreds of thousands of outdoor recreation participants annually, contributing to a measurable reduction in human-wildlife conflicts throughout the region. The comprehensive safety protocols and emergency response procedures developed following the incident became standard practice for wilderness recreation programs and professional guide services. The Tyler Grant and Jason Miller Memorial Scholarship had supported over 200 students pursuing careers in wildlife management, outdoor recreation safety, and mechanical engineering by 2045, creating a lasting positive impact that extended far beyond the tragic circumstances that had prompted its creation. Many scholarship recipients went on to prominent careers in fields directly related to preventing similar tragedies. The psychological impact of the attack gradually diminished within the outdoor recreation community, though it remained a reference point for discussions about acceptable risk in wilderness activities. Younger generations of snowmobilers learned about the incident as historical context rather than immediate trauma, allowing for more objective analysis of the lessons it offered about wilderness safety and wildlife behavior. The attack site itself returned to its natural state, with no visible evidence remaining of the events that had occurred there 20 years earlier. Wildlife monitoring continued to document normal grizzly bear use of the area, including occasional denning activity during particularly severe winters. The presence of bears was now considered a positive indicator of ecosystem health, rather than a management problem requiring intervention. The families of Tyler Grant and Jason Miller found different ways to honor their sons' memories, while building meaningful lives beyond the tragedy that had shaped their experiences for 2 decades. The annual memorial services evolved into celebrations of wilderness conservation and outdoor recreation safety, bringing together diverse communities united by their shared commitment to the values the 2 young men had embodied. The legislative and policy changes prompted by the attack proved to be among its most lasting impacts, with improved funding for wildlife monitoring, enhanced search and rescue capabilities, and better educational programs reaching outdoor recreation participants throughout the region. These changes contributed to a measurable improvement in wilderness safety statistics. Though similar fatal encounters with grizzly bears continued to occur occasionally throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. The January 16, 2025 grizzly bear attack on Tyler Grant and Jason Miller ultimately became more than just a tragic incident involving two young outdoor enthusiasts and a protective mother bear. It evolved into a touchstone for broader discussions about the relationship between human recreation and wildlife conservation, the acceptable level of risk in wilderness activities, and the responsibility of society to protect both human safety and the natural predator-prey relationships that define healthy ecosystems. The exhaustive documentation and analysis of every aspect of the incident, from the victims' final social media posts to the long-term psychological impacts on their families and communities, created an unprecedented resource for understanding human-wildlife conflict in recreational settings. This comprehensive record influenced wildlife management practices, outdoor recreation policies, and emergency response protocols throughout North America and beyond. 25 years after the attack, in 2050, the incident remained relevant to new generations of wildlife managers and outdoor recreation professionals who continued to grapple with the fundamental tension between providing access to wild places and protecting both human visitors and the wildlife populations that made those places wild. The detailed timeline of events on that crystal-clear January morning continued to serve as a teaching tool and reference point for anyone seeking to understand the complex dynamics of human-wildlife coexistence. The legacy of Tyler James Grant and Jason David Miller extended far beyond their tragic deaths, encompassing the thousands of people who had been influenced by educational programs developed in their memory, the wildlife conservation efforts funded by their Memorial Foundation, and the improved safety protocols that had prevented similar tragedies. Their passion for wilderness adventure, cut short by an unavoidable encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators, had ultimately contributed to a better understanding of how humans could share wild places with wild animals while minimizing risks to both species. The memorial plaque at the Lost Horse Trail staging area, weathered by 25 years of Montana winters but still clearly legible, continued to remind visitors that wilderness recreation carried inherent risks that could never be completely eliminated. The inscription's message about respecting wildlife while pursuing outdoor adventure remained as relevant in 2050 as it had been on the day it was installed, serving as both warning and inspiration for new generations of wilderness enthusiasts. The grizzly bear population in the northern Rocky Mountain region had continued to recover and expand during the quarter century following the attack, with bears reoccupying much of their historic range and occasionally creating new human-wildlife conflict situations. Each new encounter was analyzed using protocols and procedures developed following the January 16, 2025 attack, ensuring that the lessons learned from Tyler and Jason's deaths continued to inform wildlife management decisions. The attack had ultimately demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of human efforts to manage wildlife encounters in recreational settings. While improved education, monitoring, and emergency response capabilities had reduced the frequency of fatal encounters, the fundamental reality remained that sharing wild places with powerful predators carried risks that could never be entirely eliminated without destroying the wildness that made such places valuable. The comprehensive record of the January 16th, 2025 grizzly bear attack on Tyler Grant and Jason Miller thus served not only as a memorial to two young men who had died pursuing their passion for wilderness adventure, but as an enduring resource for anyone seeking to understand the complex relationships between human recreation, wildlife conservation, and the acceptable level of risk in a world where truly wild places remained accessible to ordinary people seeking extraordinary experiences in the natural world. The next stories. Natchez, July 4th, 2024. Bear attacks, family. During fireworks show in Colorado Park, July 4th, 2024. Bear attacks, family. During fireworks show in Colorado Park. The morning air in Estes Park, Colorado carried the crisp scent of pine and the distant aroma of barbecue smoke as thousands of visitors prepared for the town's annual 4th of July celebration. At 7,847 feet above sea level, the mountain town nestled against the eastern entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park had become a tradition for families seeking the perfect blend of patriotic celebration and wilderness beauty. What nobody knew as they spread their blankets and unpacked their coolers was that this Independence Day would be remembered not for its spectacular fireworks, but for the terror that would unfold beneath the starlit sky. Derek Walters adjusted his Denver Broncos cap against the morning sun as he surveyed the prime spot his family had claimed near Riverside Plaza, just 50 yards from where the fireworks would be launched over the Big Thompson River. At 38, Derek was a mechanical engineer with a methodical approach to everything, including family vacations. He'd researched the best viewing locations for weeks, cross-referencing wind patterns, launch trajectories, and crowd density maps he'd found on local tourism websites. His wife Anna often teased him about his over-preparation, but she appreciated how it usually resulted in memorable experiences for their 11-year-old daughter Chloe. Anna Walters sat cross-legged on their red and blue checkered blanket, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it away from her face as she organized their supplies. As a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado, Anna had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs before they arose. Their cooler contained not just sandwiches and drinks, but a first aid kit, insect repellent, sunscreen, wet wipes, and enough snacks to feed a small army. She'd learned from years of camping trips that preparation prevented most problems, and problems prevented fun. 11-year-old Chloe Walters bounced between sitting still and exploring the immediate area around their blanket, her energy barely contained by her parents' reminders to stay close. She wore a red, white, and blue striped shirt her grandmother had bought specifically for this trip, and her blonde hair was adorned with small American flag clips that caught the sunlight as she moved. Chloe had been talking about this trip for months, ever since Derek had surprised the family with reservations at the Stanley Hotel and tickets to what was supposedly one of Colorado's best fireworks displays. The Walters family had arrived in Estes Park 3 days earlier, spending their time exploring the town's shops, hiking easy trails in Rocky Mountain National Park, and enjoying the slower pace of mountain life. Derek had insisted on several practice runs to their chosen fireworks viewing location, timing their walk from the hotel and identifying bathroom locations, food vendors, and exit routes with the thoroughness of a military operation. Anna had rolled her eyes at his excessive planning, but even she had to admit that knowing exactly where everything was located gave them a sense of security in the crowded environment. By 4 in the afternoon, Riverside Plaza and the surrounding area had transformed into a sea of blankets, folding chairs, and families. The Big Thompson River gurgled peacefully alongside the gathering crowd, its waters running clear and cold from the recent snowmelt in the high country. Children played in the shallow areas under their parents' watchful eyes, and teenagers tossed frisbees in the open spaces between family settlements. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional burst of a premature firecracker from an impatient celebrant. The Martinez family had claimed a spot 20 feet to the north of the Walters, their 3 boys ranging in age from 6 to 14, creating a constant buzz of activity around their base camp. Roberto Martinez, a construction foreman from Denver, had brought a portable grill and was cooking burgers for what seemed like half the families in their immediate area. His wife, Sofia, kept a watchful eye on their youngest, 6-year-old Miguel, while managing the logistics of feeding the neighborhood. Their middle son, 10-year-old Diego, had quickly befriended Chloe, and the two were engaged in an elaborate game involving the collection and categorization of interesting rocks from the riverbank. 40 feet to the south, the Henderson family from Fort Collins had arrived with military precision that rivaled Derek's preparation. James Henderson, a retired Air Force colonel, had positioned their party of 8 family members in a formation that allowed for optimal viewing while maintaining clear sightlines to all exits. His wife Margaret, a former army nurse, had transformed their area into what looked like a temporary field hospital, complete with multiple first aid kits, emergency radios, and enough supplies to handle any conceivable crisis. Their 4 grandchildren, visiting from various states, had initially been intimidated by their grandfather's organizational intensity, but had quickly adapted to his systematic approach to fun. As the afternoon wore on, more families continued to arrive and fill in the remaining spaces around the plaza. The Johnsons, an elderly couple from Nebraska celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, had brought folding chairs and a thermos of coffee, claiming they were too old for blankets on the ground, but too excited about the fireworks to miss the show. Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer from Boulder, had positioned herself with professional equipment at the edge of the crowd, hoping to capture the perfect shot of fireworks reflecting in the river while families watched in silhouette. Dr. Michael Torres, an emergency room physician from Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, had reluctantly agreed to attend the celebration with his teenage daughter Emma after she'd convinced him they needed to do something fun together before she left for college. Michael's medical background made him instinctively scan crowds for potential problems, noting the location of emergency vehicles, the width of exit routes, and the general health and sobriety of the people around them. His daughter found his constant vigilance embarrassing, but she'd inherited enough of his analytical nature to appreciate the logic behind his observations. The local emergency services had prepared extensively for the event, with Estes Park Police, Fire Department, and Emergency Medical Services all maintaining increased staffing levels and strategic positioning throughout the area. Chief of Police Barbara Stone had worked with her officers to develop a comprehensive security plan that included both uniformed and plainclothes personnel scattered throughout the crowd. Fire Chief David Wright had positioned 2 fire engines and an ambulance within 3 minutes of the plaza, while EMS Supervisor Lisa Grant had coordinated with nearby hospitals to ensure adequate trauma capacity for the expected holiday injuries. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the local wildlife biologist for Rocky Mountain National Park, had spent the weeks leading up to the 4th of July celebration monitoring bear activity in the area surrounding Estes Park. The unusual heat wave that had gripped Colorado for the past month had driven many animals to lower elevations in search of water and food, creating more frequent human-wildlife encounters throughout the region. Her tracking data showed increased black bear activity near the town's perimeter, but nothing that suggested any immediate danger to the holiday celebration. What Dr. Walsh's tracking couldn't account for was the presence of a 7-year-old male grizzly bear that had wandered far outside its normal range in search of food sources made scarce by the drought conditions in the high country. This particular bear, later designated as Bear 541 by wildlife officials, had learned to associate human activity with food opportunities after several encounters at campsites and garbage facilities over the previous summer. Unlike the more common black bears in the area, this grizzly was significantly larger, more aggressive, and had developed a concerning lack of fear around humans. Bear 541 had been moving through the drainage systems that surrounded Estes Park for 3 days, following scent trails that led toward the concentration of human activity near the town center. The bear's normal territory encompassed nearly 40 square miles of remote wilderness, but the combination of drought conditions, food scarcity, and the powerful attractants associated with large gatherings of people had drawn him steadily toward what would become a tragic collision of human celebration and wild animal desperation. As evening approached and the sky began its gradual transition toward darkness, the crowd's anticipation grew increasingly palpable. Parents helped children into warmer clothes as the mountain air began its characteristic cooling, and vendors circulated through the gathering selling glow sticks, small American flags, and last-minute snacks. The Big Thompson River continued its peaceful flow, occasionally reflecting the warm lights from the surrounding buildings and creating a picture-perfect scene that would soon be shattered by chaos. Derek Walters checked his watch for what Anna estimated was the 20th time in the past hour, confirming that they still had 90 minutes until the scheduled start of the fireworks display. He'd brought a small camping chair for Anna, who appreciated having back support during long periods of sitting, while he and Chloe were content with their positions on the blanket. Their spot offered an unobstructed view of the launch area while being far enough back to avoid falling debris, a detail Derek had researched extensively in online forums dedicated to fireworks safety. Chloe had tired of her rock collection game with Diego Martinez and was now lying on her stomach, drawing pictures of fireworks in a small notebook her mother had packed. Her artistic representations showed stick figures of her family watching elaborate explosions of color, and she'd carefully labeled each family member with their names. Anna smiled, watching her daughter's creative process, remembering her own childhood excitement about special events and the way anticipation could make time seem to crawl. The surrounding families had settled into the comfortable routine of waiting, with conversations flowing easily between strangers brought together by shared anticipation. Roberto Martinez had finished grilling and was sharing his extra burgers with the Henderson family, whose military logistics had somehow failed to account for adequate dinner supplies. The elderly Johnsons were telling stories about 4th of July celebrations from decades past, their voices carrying the wisdom and perspective that comes from experiencing 70 years of Independence Day traditions. As twilight deepened, the first signs of Bear 541's approach went unnoticed by the celebrating crowd. The bear had followed the scent trail along the river system, moving with the careful deliberation that characterizes apex predators in unfamiliar territory. Unlike the smaller black bears that occasionally wandered through Estes Park, this grizzly moved with a confidence and power that suggested he viewed the human settlement not as a threat to be avoided, but as a resource to be investigated. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was at her office 3 miles away, reviewing the day's wildlife reports and preparing to drive home to her own family celebration, unaware that the most dangerous predator in the region was approaching the largest gathering of potential prey in the area. Her radio remained quiet, with no reports of unusual animal activity from the various park rangers and wildlife officers scattered throughout the region. The evening seemed perfect for a peaceful holiday celebration. Bear 541 had reached the tree line approximately 400 yards from the main concentration of families, close enough to clearly identify the sounds and smells that had drawn him toward the human settlement. The bear's acute sense of smell, roughly 7 times more sensitive than a bloodhound's, was overwhelmed by the mixture of food aromas emanating from the celebration. Grilled meat, sweet desserts, and the concentrated human scent of nearly 2,000 people created an olfactory landscape that the hungry bear interpreted as an unprecedented feeding opportunity. The bear's behavior during this approach phase displayed the complex decision-making process that makes grizzlies particularly dangerous in human encounter situations. Unlike prey animals that rely primarily on flight responses or territorial animals that display clear warning behaviors, a grizzly assessing a potential food source will often remain hidden while gathering information about risks and opportunities. Bear 541 spent nearly an hour at the tree line, moving carefully between positions that allowed him to observe the human activity while remaining concealed. Chief Barbara Stone was conducting her regular security sweep through the crowd, checking in with her officers and noting the generally peaceful atmosphere that characterized successful community events. Her radio chatter was limited to routine position reports and minor issues like lost children and intoxicated individuals who needed gentle redirection away from family areas. Nothing in her 23 years of law enforcement experience had prepared her for managing a large predator attack, though her department's emergency protocols included general procedures for wildlife encounters. The fireworks crew was conducting their final safety checks and preparation procedures, unaware that their carefully choreographed pyrotechnic display would soon provide a horrific backdrop for a scene of chaos and terror. Lead pyrotechnician Mark Stevens had been launching 4th of July displays in mountain communities for 15 years, and his crew's reputation for safety and spectacular shows had made them the preferred contractor for celebrations throughout Colorado's Front Range communities. At 8:45 p.m., with full darkness finally settling over the valley and stars becoming visible in the clear mountain sky, Bear 541 made the decision that would transform a peaceful family celebration into a nightmare that would haunt survivors for years to come. The bear's movement from the tree line toward the concentrated human activity was deliberate and purposeful, displaying none of the hesitation or defensive behavior that characterizes most wildlife encounters with humans. The first person to notice something unusual was Sarah Chen, the wildlife photographer, who had positioned herself at the edge of the crowd with equipment designed to capture low-light images. Her trained eye caught movement at the periphery of her vision, and her initial assumption was that she might have the opportunity to photograph one of the black bears that occasionally wandered through the area. Her excitement at this unexpected opportunity quickly turned to concern as she realized the animal approaching the crowd was significantly larger than any black bear she'd encountered. Sarah's years of wildlife photography had taught her to quickly assess animal behavior and distinguish between species based on silhouette, movement patterns, and size characteristics. What she saw moving toward the crowd displayed the distinctive shoulder hump, elongated snout, and powerful build that clearly identified it as a grizzly bear, a species she knew was extremely rare in this area and exponentially more dangerous than the black bears that locals had grown accustomed to avoiding. Her attempt to quietly alert nearby families was interrupted by the thunderous opening salvo of the fireworks display, as Mark Stevens' crew launched the first series of aerial shells into the darkening sky. The brilliant explosions of red, white, and blue light illuminated the entire plaza and surrounding area, creating a strobing effect that alternately revealed and concealed the approaching bear while simultaneously masking the sounds of Sarah's warnings with the crowd's cheers and the explosive concussions echoing off the surrounding mountains. Bear 541's reaction to the sudden noise and light display demonstrated the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters in high-stress situations. Rather than retreating from the overwhelming sensory assault, the bear seemed to interpret the fireworks as a territorial challenge or threat display. triggering an aggressive response that combined his natural predatory instincts with the defensive behaviors that make grizzly bears so dangerous when they feel cornered or challenged. The bear's charge toward the crowd was not the mindless rampage that witnesses would later describe to investigators, but rather the calculated attack pattern of an apex predator that had identified a large concentration of potential prey in a confined space. His approach route took advantage of the natural terrain features and the crowd's positioning, allowing him to reach the densest concentration of people before most individuals realized what was happening. Derek Walters was pointing out the technical aspects of the fireworks display to Chloe, explaining how the different colors were created by various metallic compounds when Anna's scream cut through the noise and chaos. Her nursing background had trained her to quickly identify emergencies, and her view of the crowd's perimeter had given her a clear line of sight to the massive shape charging toward their position. Her warning cry was lost in the general noise of the celebration, but her physical reaction as she grabbed for Chloe alerted Derek that something was catastrophically wrong. The next 90 seconds would later be reconstructed by investigators using witness testimony, cell phone video footage, and physical evidence, but the chaos and terror of those moments made accurate recall extremely difficult for most survivors. What emerged from the investigation was a timeline of events that demonstrated both the unpredictable nature of wildlife attacks and the tragic randomness that determined who would survive and who would not. Bear 541 reached the outer edge of the crowd at 8:47 p.m., just as the second volley of fireworks exploded overhead in a cascade of golden light that illuminated the scene with surreal clarity. The bear's initial contact was with the Johnson family, the elderly couple from Nebraska who had positioned their folding chairs at what they thought was a safe distance from the more crowded family areas. Harold Johnson, 83 years old and a veteran of the Korean War, had survived combat situations and thought he understood fear, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight of 700 pounds of muscle and claws bearing down on his position. The bear's attack on Harold Johnson lasted less than 10 seconds, but the elderly man's screams and the sight of the massive predator tearing through their peaceful gathering created an immediate panic reaction that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Margaret Johnson, Harold's wife of 50 years, was knocked unconscious when the bear's initial swipe, intended for her husband, caught her across the side of her head, sending her crashing into their cooler and camping chairs. The bear's movement through the crowd followed the path of least resistance, which unfortunately led directly toward the concentration of families with young children who had positioned themselves for optimal viewing of the fireworks display. Roberto Martinez saw the bear approaching his family's position and made the split-second decision to place himself between the predator and his 3 sons, a choice that probably saved their lives, but cost him his own. Roberto's confrontation with Bear 541 provided the first clear evidence of the grizzly's size and aggressive intent. The bear stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and weighed an estimated 700 pounds, with claws that extended 4 inches from massive paws capable of crushing bones with a single swipe. Roberto Martinez was a strong man, hardened by years of construction work, but he was no match for a predator that could take down elk and moose with casual efficiency. The bear's attack on Roberto was witnessed by dozens of people, including his own family, and would later be described by investigators as textbook predatory behavior. Rather than the defensive swatting or brief contact typical of most bear encounters, Bear 541 demonstrated the focused aggression and sustained attack pattern of a grizzly that was actively hunting rather than simply defending territory or cubs. Sophia Martinez's screams for help were finally heard by Chief Barbara Stone, who was positioned approximately 100 yards away and initially assumed she was dealing with a fireworks accident or medical emergency. Her radio call for medical assistance was the first official notification that something was wrong at the celebration, though she still had no idea that a large predator was actively attacking civilians in the middle of the crowd. The bear's movement from the Martinez family toward the Walters family was captured on cell phone video by several witnesses, providing investigators with crucial evidence about the animal's behavior and attack patterns. The footage showed Bear 541 moving with purpose and confidence through the panicking crowd, ignoring easier targets in favor of the family group that had been his apparent objective from the beginning of his approach. Derek Walters' attempt to protect his family demonstrated both courage and the tragic inadequacy of human physical capabilities when confronted by an apex predator. His decision to push Anna and Chloe behind him while attempting to make himself appear larger and more threatening was based on wildlife safety advice designed for black bear encounters. But grizzly bears require entirely different defensive strategies that few people understand or can effectively implement in crisis situations. The bear's initial contact with Derek Walters occurred at 8:49 p.m., just as the fireworks display reached its crescendo with a series of massive aerial shells that illuminated the entire scene in brilliant white light. Witnesses reported that the timing created a horrifically cinematic effect, with the sounds of Derek's screams mixing with the explosive concussions overhead, while the strobing light alternately revealed and obscured the attack in progress. Anna Walters' training as a pediatric nurse had included basic trauma response protocols, but nothing in her medical background had prepared her for the reality of watching her husband being attacked by a predator while trying to protect their 11-year-old daughter. Her instinctive response was to shield Chloe while simultaneously trying to help Derek, a dual obligation that left her exposed to the bear's attention as he finished his assault on her husband. Bear 541's attack on Anna Walters was different from his previous encounters, displaying what wildlife experts would later describe as territorial behavior mixed with predatory intent. Rather than the quick, decisive strikes that had characterized his attacks on the other victims, the bear seemed to view Anna as a secondary threat that required more careful handling, an assessment that probably saved her life but resulted in more extensive injuries. 11-year-old Chloe Walters' survival would later be attributed to a combination of her small size, her mother's protective positioning, and the bear's apparent focus on what he perceived as the primary threats in the group. Her injuries, while serious, were significantly less severe than those suffered by her parents, and her ability to remain still and quiet during the attack demonstrated either remarkable courage or the kind of shock-induced paralysis that sometimes protects victims in overwhelming trauma situations. The first emergency responders to reach the scene were Estes Park police officers Jennifer Liu and David Schmidt, who had been positioned approximately 300 yards away when Chief Stone's radio call alerted them to a major emergency at the plaza. Their response time of 4 minutes and 30 seconds was considered excellent given the distance and crowd density, but those crucial minutes allowed Bear 541 to complete his attacks and begin moving away from the immediate scene. Officer Liu's first radio report provided the initial official confirmation of what had happened. "Chief, we have multiple victims of what appears to be a large animal attack. We need all available medical units, and I'm requesting immediate wildlife assistance. This is not a black bear situation." Her voice carried the controlled urgency of a professional dealing with a crisis beyond her training or experience, but she maintained the composure necessary to coordinate an effective emergency response. The bear's departure from the scene was as sudden and purposeful as his arrival, with Bear 541 moving back toward the tree line while the crowd continued to panic and emergency responders struggled to reach the victims through the chaos of nearly 2,000 people trying to evacuate the area simultaneously. Several witnesses reported seeing the bear pause at the edge of the plaza, looking back toward the crowd as if assessing his work before disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lighting. Dr. Michael Torres, the emergency room physician who had attended the celebration with his daughter, was the first medical professional to reach the victims. His assessment of the scene was transmitted via radio to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, providing the trauma team with their first indication of what they would be dealing with. Multiple victims with severe trauma consistent with large animal attacks. I count at least 4 critical patients requiring immediate surgical intervention. We need to clear the trauma bay and get orthopedic surgery standing by. The medical response to the bear attack demonstrated both the effectiveness of Colorado's trauma system and the unique challenges posed by multiple victims with similar injury patterns. Harold Johnson was transported to McKee Medical Center in Loveland with head trauma and multiple lacerations, while Roberto Martinez was pronounced dead at the scene after Dr. Torres determined that his injuries were not survivable given the available resources and response time. Derek Walters was transported to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital in critical condition, with multiple compound fractures, severe lacerations, and internal injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. The trauma team's initial assessment indicated that he had suffered injuries to multiple organ systems, with particular concern about internal bleeding and potential spinal cord damage from the bear's attack. Anna Walters was transported to the same facility with serious but not immediately life-threatening injuries, including lacerations to her arms and legs, a dislocated shoulder, and suspected concussion from being knocked unconscious during the attack. Her medical background had helped her provide preliminary first aid to herself and her daughter while waiting for professional assistance, actions that probably prevented more serious complications. Chloe Walters was treated for minor lacerations and shock at the scene before being transported to Children's Hospital Colorado as a precautionary measure. Her physical injuries were relatively minor, but the psychological trauma of witnessing her parents' attacks would require extensive treatment and support in the months to come. The emergency response involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions working together to manage both the immediate medical crisis and the ongoing threat posed by Bear 541's continued presence in the area. Colorado Parks and wildlife officers were dispatched to begin tracking the bear, while additional law enforcement personnel worked to secure the scene and manage the evacuation of remaining civilians from the danger zone. Dr. Jennifer Walsh received the emergency call at her home at 9:15 p.m. and immediately began coordinating the wildlife response with local law enforcement and emergency services. Her initial assessment, based on witness descriptions and the nature of the injuries, confirmed that the attacking animal was indeed a grizzly bear, a species whose presence in the area represented a significant escalation in the danger level for both responders and the surrounding community. The decision to authorize lethal force against Bear 541 was made by Colorado Parks and Wildlife Director Sarah Martinez after consultation with wildlife experts and law enforcement officials. The bears demonstrated aggression toward humans, combined with the densely populated area and the ongoing risk to public safety, made capture and relocation impossible under the circumstances. The hunt for Bear 541 began at first light on July 5th, with a team of experienced wildlife officers tracking dogs and emergency responders working to locate and neutralize the bear before he could injure additional victims. The operation was complicated by the mountainous terrain, the bear's apparent intelligence and caution, and the need to ensure that innocent wildlife in the area was not accidentally targeted during the search. Bear 541 was located and killed at 2:30 p.m. on July 5th, approximately 6 miles from the attack site, by Colorado Parks and Wildlife Officer Mark Stevens and his tracking dog Rex. The bear was found feeding on a deer carcass in a remote drainage, behavior that suggested he had returned to normal feeding patterns after the previous night's attacks. The necropsy performed on Bear 541 revealed that he was significantly underweight for his size, supporting the theory that food scarcity had driven his aggressive behavior toward humans. The investigation into the attack involved multiple agencies and lasted for several weeks, with particular focus on identifying any factors that might have contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior and presence in the area. The final report concluded that the attack was the result of an unusual combination of environmental factors, including drought conditions, food scarcity, and the bear's previous exposure to human food sources that had reduced his natural fear of people. Derek Walters underwent 6 surgeries over the course of 3 weeks, with doctors working to repair the extensive damage to his arms, legs, and internal organs. His recovery was complicated by infections and setbacks that required additional procedures, but his survival was considered remarkable given the severity of his injuries. The physical rehabilitation process would continue for months, with uncertain prospects for full recovery of all his previous capabilities. Anna Walters' physical recovery was more straightforward, though the psychological trauma of the attack created challenges that would require professional counseling and support. Her experience as a healthcare professional helped her understand the medical aspects of her family's treatment, but it also gave her a clinical awareness of how close they had come to losing everything that made coping with the trauma more difficult. Chloe Walters' psychological recovery became the focus of intensive therapy and support services, with particular attention to helping her process the traumatic memories of witnessing her parents' attacks. Child psychologists noted that her age and developmental stage would influence how she integrated the experience into her understanding of the world, with potential long-term effects that might not become apparent for years. The lawsuit filed by the Walters family against Estes Park and Colorado Parks and Wildlife alleged inadequate warning systems, insufficient wildlife monitoring, and negligent emergency planning for the July 4th celebration. The legal proceedings would continue for 2 years, ultimately resulting in a settlement that included provisions for improved wildlife detection and warning systems for future public events in bear habitat areas. The media coverage of the bear attack sparked national discussions about wildlife management, public safety at outdoor events, and the increasing frequency of human-wildlife conflicts in areas where development was encroaching on traditional animal habitats. The footage captured by witnesses became part of the permanent record of the event, serving as both evidence in legal proceedings and educational material for wildlife safety programs. Roberto Martinez's funeral was attended by hundreds of community members, including many who had witnessed his heroic attempt to protect his family from the attacking bear. His widow Sophia and their 3 sons established a foundation dedicated to wildlife safety education, using Roberto's sacrifice as motivation to prevent similar tragedies through better public awareness and preparation. Harold Johnson survived his injuries but never fully recovered from the trauma of the attack, passing away 6 months later from complications related to his physical and psychological wounds. His death was officially attributed to the bear attack, making him the second fatality from the July 4th incident and intensifying the legal and political ramifications of the tragedy. The long-term impact of the bear attack extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, affecting the entire Estes Park community and changing how Colorado manages wildlife risks at public events. The incident led to new protocols for wildlife monitoring, improved emergency response procedures, and enhanced public education about the realities of living and recreating in bear habitat, Dr. Jennifer Walsh's career was forever changed by the events of July 4th, as she dedicated herself to developing better systems for predicting and preventing human-wildlife conflicts. Her research into Bear 541's behavior patterns and the environmental factors that contributed to the attack became the foundation for new approaches to wildlife management in areas with high human populations. The Walters family's recovery continued for years after the attack, with each member dealing with different aspects of the trauma in their own way. Derek's physical limitations required significant adjustments to his career and daily life, while Anna struggled with survivor's guilt and hypervigilance about potential dangers. Chloe's therapy helped her develop coping strategies, but the experience remained a defining element of her childhood and would influence her relationships and life choices well into adulthood. The July 4th bear attack in Estes Park became a case study used in wildlife management programs, emergency response training, and trauma psychology research. The extensive documentation of the event, including witness testimony, medical records, and physical evidence, provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the complex factors that contribute to catastrophic human-wildlife encounters. 5 years after the attack, the Walters family returned to Estes Park for the first time, participating in a memorial service for Roberto Martinez and Harold Johnson, while marking their own survival and recovery. The visit was part of their ongoing healing process, an attempt to reclaim positive associations with a place that had been the setting for their worst nightmare. The memorial, established at Riverside Plaza, includes plaques honoring the victims and survivors of the bear attack, along with educational displays about wildlife safety and the importance of respecting the natural environment. The site serves as both a remembrance of the tragedy and a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance and preparation when humans and wildlife share the same spaces. The fireworks display that had provided such a horrific backdrop for the bear attack was never held again at Riverside Plaza, with the community choosing to relocate their Independence Day celebration to a venue with better emergency access and wildlife management capabilities. The decision reflected the lasting impact of the tragedy on the community's sense of safety and their approach to public gatherings in areas with potential wildlife risks. Bear 541's story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of human expansion into wildlife habitat and the importance of maintaining natural fear responses in wild animals through proper food storage and waste management. The bear's path from wild predator to human threat illustrated the complex challenges facing wildlife managers as development continues to fragment and reduce natural habitat areas throughout the American West. The investigation's final report identified multiple opportunities for prevention that could have avoided the tragedy, from better wildlife monitoring systems to improved public education about the differences between black bear and grizzly bear safety protocols. These findings led to policy changes and funding allocations designed to reduce the risk of similar incidents in other communities facing human-wildlife interface challenges. The medical teams that treated the attack victims used the experience to develop new protocols for managing multiple trauma patients with similar injury patterns, contributing to improvements in emergency medicine that would benefit future victims of both wildlife attacks and other mass casualty events. The collaboration between multiple hospitals and specialties demonstrated the importance of coordinated response systems in managing complex medical emergencies. The psychological impact of the bear attack extended beyond the immediate victims to include witnesses, first responders, and community members who struggled to process the sudden transformation of a peaceful celebration into a scene of terror and violence. Counseling services were provided for months after the incident, helping people cope with the trauma of witnessing or responding to such an unprecedented event in their community. The legal ramifications of the attack continued to influence wildlife management policies and public event planning procedures throughout Colorado and other western states. The precedents established in the Walters family lawsuit affected how government agencies assess and communicate wildlife risks to the public, with increased emphasis on proactive measures rather than reactive responses. The educational legacy of the July 4th bear attack includes training materials, safety protocols, and research studies that help communities better prepare for the possibility of human-wildlife conflicts at public gatherings. The tragedy's documentation serves as a resource for emergency planners, wildlife managers, and community leaders working to balance public recreation with wildlife conservation in areas where these interests intersect. 10 years later, the survivors of the bear attack continue to advocate for improved wildlife safety measures and better public education about the realities of living in areas where humans and large predators share the landscape. Their experience provides a powerful voice in discussions about development patterns, recreation management, and the responsibility of individuals and communities to minimize conflicts with wildlife. The story of July 4th, 2024, serves as a reminder that nature remains wild and unpredictable despite human attempts to control and manage the environment around us. The tragedy illustrates both the vulnerability of human civilization to natural forces and the resilience of individuals and communities in responding to unimaginable challenges. The bear attack changed the lives of everyone it touched, but it also demonstrated the capacity of human beings to survive, adapt, and work together to prevent similar tragedies in the future.